They say history is written by the victors, but what about the stories that were buried with the losers? The facts too bizarre to teach, too inconvenient to remember, and too disturbing to forget. From empires that vanished overnight to emperors who feasted themselves to death, this isn't your schoolbook timeline. These are the shadows between the chapters, the truths they hoped you'd never find. So dim the lights and hold your breath, because once you hear these 100 disturbing historical facts, you might start to wonder how much of what we know was never meant to be known at all. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the stories they'd rather keep buried. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now?
Midnight in Berlin? 3 a.m. in Kansas? We want to know who else is wandering the dark with us.
The Dancing Plague of 1518. Strasbourg, 1518. The sun bakes the cobblestones in July, and a lone woman named Frau Trophia steps into the street and begins to dance. No music, no joy. Just an uncontrollable compulsion, her limbs jerking in defiance of her will. She keeps dancing through the day, then the night, and the next day, and the next. By the end of the week, 30 others have joined her. By the end of the month, the number climbs into the hundreds. This was not a celebration. It was an epidemic. A strange, silent frenzy with no laughter and no known cause. People collapsed from exhaustion, seizures, strokes, heart attacks. Authorities, in one of history's most absurdly ironic public health responses, commissioned musicians and cleared out halls to allow the afflicted to dance it out. More music, more space, more death. It was a therapeutic rave born from a bureaucrat's fever dream. What was it? Ergot poisoning? Psychogenic illness? Repressed trauma from years of famine, plague, and divine punishment culture? No theory holds without falling apart somewhere. Because what's disturbing isn't just that they danced themselves to death, it's that the city watched, enabled, amplified, all while claiming it was a solution. Historians would later try to reduce it to a footnote in the psychology of crowds, but there's something uneasy lurking between those lines. This wasn't the last time the world chose choreography over clarity, spectacle over sense. Sometimes the dance becomes the distraction, and no one wants to stop the music. Because what came next wasn't rhythmic or even remotely understandable. It was the summer that never happened. The year without a summer, 1816. In the year 1816, the skies forgot their role and the seasons malfunctioned. Snow fell in June, frost curled around crops in July, and August? It had the decency to apologize by killing what little vegetation was left. This was no ordinary cold snap, it was a planetary betrayal triggered by the explosive wrath of Mount Tambora, an Indonesian volcano that had erupted with such catastrophic force in April 1815 that it spat 100 cubic kilometers of debris into the sky and blotted out the sun like a tantrum from the underworld. Europeans starved as wheat failed to rise from the soil. In New England, birds froze mid-flight, and people slaughtered their livestock just to avoid watching them starve. A gloomy Swiss summer trapped a few romantic intellectuals in a lakeside villa where, bored and frostbitten, Mary Shelley stitched together a story about a monster born from unnatural science. Meanwhile, reality was already doing a better job. Millions were dying from famine and disease as a result of the ash cloud-induced climate anomaly. The weather was so erratic that some assumed divine punishment, others suspected sunspot cycles, and a few simply declared that the end times had arrived early. What's most disturbing isn't the anomaly itself, it's the eerie silence that followed. We still don't teach this in schools as a pivotal moment of global collapse. Maybe because it wasn't a war. Maybe because no one could be blamed. but a summer that didn't come as a metaphor historians tend to step around. It's hard to footnote a missing season. Harder still when nature's fury is so easily eclipsed by the fragile warmth of human memory. But when governments do get involved, when the absurd becomes official policy, nature starts looking like the sane one. Speaking of which, let's talk about the time Australia declared war on birds. The Emu War, 1932. Australia, 1932. Veterans of World War I, now repurposed as farmers, returned to their fields in Western Australia only to find their crops under siege, not by drought, not by locusts, but by an army of 6-foot, flightless birds, emuscient, curious, utterly indifferent. To fences descended upon farmlands in the thousands. Their movements were relentless. Their motivations unknowable. They tore through wheat fields like feathery tanks, leaving chaos and pecked earth in their wake. So naturally, the government declared war. Operation Emu Suppression was greenlit with full military involvement. Soldiers with machine guns were dispatched. The birds, predictably, did not organize into tidy rows or stand their ground for heroic last stands. They scattered. They vanished into the brush. They regrouped. They outmaneuvered. The humans, clunky in boots and bureaucracy, found themselves outwitted by animals with walnut-sized brains and GPS-level navigation skills. The military logged thousands of rounds fired and only a few hundred confirmed kills. Emus, it turns out, can sprint 30 miles per hour and have armor-like feathers that deflect bullets. The troops eventually withdrew, defeated. The emus held the territory. No formal peace treaty was signed, but the war ended anyway in humiliation and silence. To this day, the Emu War is one of those historical episodes that sounds like satire until you read the actual government reports. It's not disturbing because of the death toll, avian or otherwise. It's disturbing because of how quickly civilization can unravel into Monty Python with live ammunition. But if you think that's as bad as it gets for organized failure, wait until you hear about a city where sewage became a form of airborne terrorism. The Great Stink of London, 1858. It was the summer of 1858, and London stank like a civilization that had given up. The Thames, the pulsing blue vein of the British Empire, had become a gray-green sludge of industrial runoff, decomposing bodies, and most significantly raw human waste. The Victorian sewer system, if one could call it that, was an architectural shrug, outdated, overwhelmed, and hilariously under-engineered for a population addicted to tea, meat pies, and cholera. The heat wave made everything worse. It baked the excrement into the very air. Parliament tried to drape its windows with curtains soaked in chloride of lime to mask the stench. Newspapers used phrases like intolerable nuisance, which is Victorian code for God has forsaken this place. The river wasn't just a smell. It was a public health crisis, a visible threat, a rotting indictment of British modernity. Doctors still believed in miasma theory, bad air causes disease, and ironically, in this case, they weren't entirely wrong. The stink did correlate with outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and death in general. But the real solution came from one engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, who took one long whiff and decided to redesign London's sewer system with a vengeance. A massive network of underground tunnels was built to redirect the filth elsewhere out of sight, out of smell. The Great Stink was quietly erased from collective memory, replaced with romanticized imagery of foggy London bridges and Sherlock Holmes novels. But for a brief moment, the elite of Britain were brought nose to nose with their own refuse. Civilization, after all, is only as clean as the pipes below it. But if you're looking for something even more mysteriously absentry, a Roman legion that marched into the fog and never returned, the disappearance of the 9th Legion. Somewhere in the wilds of Roman Britain, around the 2nd century AD, the Ninth Legion Hispana marched into legend and never came back. Official records stop acknowledging them. No triumphs, no obituaries, no clear burial sites. Just a gaping historical hole where one of Rome's most battle-hardened legions used to be. These were not green recruits. They were veterans of brutal campaigns across the empire. They had built walls, crushed rebellions, and carried the imperial eagle into territories where even Rome's gods hesitated. Then, silence. Theories flail in all directions. Some suggest they were ambushed by hostile tribes in Caledonia, modern-day Scotland, cut down in a place so remote it never made the record books. Others say they were reassigned quietly to another part of the empire, and later destroyed there, perhaps in Judea or Armenia. But if that were true, why erase them so thoroughly? Why scrub their name from stone and scroll? More fringe theorists prefer the poetic version. The Ninth Legion marched into the mist and became part of the landscape absorbed into local lore, or perhaps into the bloodline of the very tribes they were sent to pacify. Their disappearance has inspired novels, films, and conspiracy-laced pub debates, but never a definitive answer. The unsettling part isn't just that they vanished, it's that no one wanted to talk about it. A whole legion, some 5,000 souls folded into myth by the silence of empire. Not exactly a recruiting poster for Roman invincibility. And yet, the empire kept its theatrics intact. They had costumes, after all, especially for those who came face to face with plague and preferred to smell something else. The plague doctor's attire. Death was the dress code. During Europe's most vicious outbreaks of the Black Death, those charged with tending to the dying began to look like nightmarish birds from a fever dream. Plague doctors wore long waxed coats, leather gloves, glass goggles, and the now infamous beaked masks. These weren't eccentric fashion choices, they were practical, sort of. The beaks were filled with aromatic herbs and spiced lavender, mint, cloves intended to ward off miasma, the bad air, then believed to transmit the disease. Imagine it. A medieval street lined with corpses, and down the alley comes a figure who looks more like a steampunk reaper than a physician. These were the frontline responders of their age, but they weren't necessarily doctors in the modern sense. Many were opportunists, conscripts, or outright frauds. They were paid well, but not expected to survive. The disturbing genius of the outfit was its contradiction. It gave the appearance of knowledge while operating under pure superstition. The mask made them feel protected, even empowered, but it did nothing. The coat, the gloves, they were just fabric barriers against a bacterial enemy no one understood. And yet, they looked the part, authority in silhouette. The image of the plague doctor became so iconic that it outlived the context. Centuries later, it would re-emerge in carnivals, horror films, and edgy Halloween costumes. A literal symbol of death turned cultural meme. But for the dying, it was never funny. The last face they saw was a hollow-eyed mask, sniffing flowers to keep from gagging. And if you think that's absurd, wait until a Roman emperor tries to appoint a senator who eats oats for a living. Caligula's horse, Incitatus. Rome, 1st century AD. The empire is bloated with power, decadence, and at least one emperor who believed his horse should hold public office. Caligula, a man whose reign was a parade of grotesque excess, had a favorite stallion named Incitatus. The horse slept in a marble stall, wore a collar of jewels, and was reportedly fed gilded oats mixed with wine. That much is absurd but plausible. The next part is where history tips over and starts to laugh at itself. Caligula allegedly planned to appoint Incitatus as consulone of the highest offices in Rome, a horse, in the Senate. Whether he actually intended to go through with it is debated. Some historians claim it was a satirical jab at the uselessness of Rome's political class. Others think he was serious, lost in a haze of megalomania and bad wine. Either way, it's not a flattering indictment of Roman governance. And the most disturbing part? The Senate didn't stop him, because by then the emperor's madness was both feared and tolerated. The boundaries between theater and power had evaporated. No one could tell whether the empire was being ruled or merely performed. And in this performance, the horse was the only character who didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. Today, we remember Incitatus not for what he did, but for what he symbolized. A civilization so arrogant, so warped by ego and spectacle, that it could mistake mockery for monarchy. Power wasn't just abused, it was ridiculed in plain sight. And speaking of things we've allowed to vanish while pretending otherwise, let's take a long, slow walk through the embers of the world's greatest library. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not afraid of a little historical discomfort. So go ahead, subscribe to the channel for more tales they'd rather you ignore. And while the next mystery brews, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it out there? Who else is up late, unraveling the past with us? The Library of Alexandria's Destruction. Once upon a time, there existed a building that held the minds of the world. A sprawling archive of scrolls, texts, and knowledge so vast, it made modern libraries look like IKEA pamphlets. The Library of Alexandria was more than just a structure, it was a philosophical declaration, a bet on the permanence of intellect. Founded in the 3rd century BCE in Egypt, it sought to collect every written work in existence. Every scroll that passed through the city's ports was seized, copied, and shelved. This was knowledge by imperial decree. Then it disappeared. Not in one cataclysmic blaze, but in a series of quiet, chaotic tragedies. A siege here, a fire there. Some blame Julius Caesar's accidental torching during a naval battle. Others point to Christian mobs, angry that pagan works still lived. Still others whisper about Islamic conquest and bureaucratic neglect. The truth is likely all of the above, death by attrition and apathy. No villain, just entropy. What makes this so disturbing isn't just the scale of the loss, it's the silence afterward. No global mourning, no international outcry, just nothing. Humanity let the world's mind burn, and we barely wrote it down. It's the same recurring theme. When knowledge is inconvenient, fragile, or just out of fashion, we abandon it, let it smolder, blame each other later. And that pattern continues, sometimes in ink, sometimes in vines, and sometimes in books no one can even read. The Voynich manuscript. It sits in a Yale vault, wrapped in confusion and paranoia. The Voynich manuscript, named after the rare book dealer who acquired it in 1912, is one of the most enigmatic documents ever discovered. Written in a looping, elegant script that matches no known language, and illustrated with bizarre botanical drawings, astrological charts, and naked women bathing in green goo. The manuscript seems less like a book and more like an elaborate dare from a forgotten world. Carbon dating places its creation in the early 15th century. But that's about all we know for sure. No one has successfully translated a word of it. The language, if it is a language, follows strange statistical patterns that suggest meaning, but no cipher has ever cracked it. The illustrations don't help either. The plants depicted don't exist. The diagrams contradict known science, and the text loops endlessly, as if it were mocking its reader. Was it a hoax? A code? A hallucination preserved on vellum? Theories have ranged from the plausible, an unknown dialect, a personal code, to the unhinged alien script, time traveler's diary, magical grimoire. But what truly disturbs scholars isn't the mystery, it's the consistency. It's too orderly to be random, too disciplined to be gibberish. Someone, somewhere, wrote this with purpose. And that purpose remains hidden. We don't know what the Voynich manuscript is, but we know what it isn't. It isn't an accident. And that makes it dangerous in the best kind of way. And speaking of deceptions, Too Good to Du now pivot to two little girls, some scissors, and a lie that enchanted the world. The Cottingley Fairies. 1917. Yorkshire, England. Two girls, Frances Griffiths and Elsie Wright, borrow a camera, walk into the woods behind their house, and return with photographic evidence of fairies, literal fairies. Wings, dresses, pointy shoes, the works. The photographs show the girls smiling serenely beside the winged creatures who flutter and pose like extras from a woodland ballet. It was quaint. It was magical. It was utterly fake. But people believed it.
Among the believers?
None other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, man who created Sherlock Holmes, a fictional detective whose entire brand revolved around logic. Doyle published the photos and declared them authentic, arguing that their purity and innocence proved their truth. His spiritualist beliefs overrode his analytical legacy. The public followed. For decades, the Cottingley fairies were taken seriously by people who should have known better. It wasn't until the 1980 SAT the women finally admitted what everyone had suspected. They'd used paper cutouts, cleverly positioned and secured with hat pins. But even then, they insisted that one of the photos might have been real. The myth refused to die. Because we don't want truth. We want enchantment. We want a reason to believe that the impossible is possible and that maybe, just maybe, there's more to the world than we can measure. The Cottingley fairies weren't dangerous, but they were a test. A test we failed. We chose wonder over wisdom, sentiment over skepticism. And that brings us to another emperor who failed all his own tests and brought the gods down with him, the Roman Emperor Elagabalus. If the Roman Empire was a circus, Elagabalus was the flaming juggler who threw raw meat into the crowd and called it communion. Ascending to power in 218 AD, at just 14 years old, Elagabalus didn't just rule Rome, he assaulted it with his taste for the surreal. He declared himself the earthly avatar of a Syrian sun god, Elagabal, and tried to shove that deity into the pantheon like a drunken party guest crashing a solemn ritual. Temples were repurposed. Sacred traditions were shattered. Rome watched in awe and nausea. But it was his personal life that disturbed even Rome's tolerance for excess. He married multiple times, including to a Vestal virgin, which was a spiritual war crime in Roman eyes, and allegedly sought gender reassignment centuries before the concept had terminology. He wore makeup to the Senate, auctioned off political positions during dinner parties, and released snakes into the crowd during public games just to see who screamed first. To some, he was a misunderstood revolutionary. To others, a walking scandal with a death wish. The Senate eventually lost patience. By 222 AD, his own guards murdered him in a latrine, dragged his corpse through the streets, and tossed it into the Tiber like a broken offering. They didn't just kill Elagabalus, they erased him. But history has a way of resurrecting its strangest ghosts. Elagabalus lives on as a cautionary tale not about deviance, but about the fragile limits of imperial indulgence. There is, apparently, a threshold beyond which even Rome would say, enough. And yet, Rome was no stranger to flames both metaphorical and literal. When fire came for the capital, the empire pointed fingers, especially at the man playing the fiddle. The Great Fire of Rome, 64 AD. In July of 64 AD, Rome caught fire, and the city burned like it had been waiting for permission. For 9 days, flames danced across the rooftops of the Eternal City, swallowing temples, tenements, and centuries of architectural arrogance. When the smoke cleared, most of Rome was ash and memory. Then came the rumors. Enter Nero, the emperor, the musician, the man who history accuses fairly or note off watching it all burn while strumming his lyre. The story goes that he sang of the fall of Troy as his own capital crumbled beneath him. But let's pause here. Did Nero actually set the fire? Probably not. But what he did afterward made him look guilty. He used the disaster to enact an ambitious urban redesign building himself a new palace complex right on the ruins. Coincidence? Rome didn't think so. To deflect the rising fury, Nero pointed his imperial finger at a small, unpopular religious sect, the Christians. He blamed them for the fire, then orchestrated one of the earliest state-sanctioned persecutions. Christians were crucified, burned alive, and torn apart in arenas, their deaths staged for public entertainment. Nero gave Rome a scapegoat, and in doing so, solidified his own infamy. The fire wasn't just a natural disaster, it was political fuel. Nero turned a city's destruction into personal opportunity and then smeared the blood across someone else's hands. History remembers him not just as a tyrant, but as a master of the dark pivot. And in the ashes of Rome, beneath the feet of the frightened and dying, lies something that has yet to be disturbed, because what if what's buried is worse than what's already known? The Terracotta Army's unopened tombs. In 1974, farmers digging a well in China stumbled onto what would become one of the most haunting archaeological finds in history: the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers standing in perfect formation, guarding the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, each face unique, each body sculpted with near-military precision, a frozen battalion meant to protect the emperor in the afterlife. And yet, the most important part of the site, the emperor's actual tomb, remains unopened. Why? Preservation, they say. The risk of exposure, contamination, decay, but also fear. Ancient records suggest the tomb is rigged with deadly traps, rivers of mercury, crossbow mechanisms designed to kill intruders, a mausoleum designed to punish curiosity. Modern testing has indeed revealed unusually high levels of mercury in the surrounding soil, enough to raise eyebrows, if not corpses. So the tomb remains sealed. A kingdom of death locked behind ancient paranoia and modern caution. What terrifies us isn't just what's inside, it's that the first emperor of a unified China took such elaborate measures to protect his legacy in death, as if he knew that history was a thief and that memory fades faster than stone. So he buried an empire with himself. We've dug up the guards, but the general still waits. And we hesitate not out of reverence but because some mysteries may be better left unsolved. Especially when those mysteries once involved putting trees on trial for murder. The ancient Greek death penalty for trees. In a society that birthed philosophy, democracy, and geometry, ancient Greece also held trials for trees. Yes, trees. If a tree fell and killed someone, it could be put on trial. Not metaphorically. Literally. The tree would be uprooted, dragged into court, and judged like any other criminal. If found guilty, it was executed, thrown out of the city, banished from the community, as if exile could reform a murderous oak. This wasn't eccentric theater. It was law. Rooted, pun entirely intended, in the belief that the world operated on a balance of cosmic justice. When that balance was upset, say, by an unfortunate tree-related death, it had to be corrected. Every act, intentional or not, carried weight. The Greeks treated inanimate objects, animals, and even architecture as capable of moral offense. The legal system reflected a deeper fear, that the world, left unregulated, would spiral into chaos. By holding a tree accountable, they weren't punishing wood, they were restoring order. The same courtrooms tried animals for theft and statues for toppling onto citizens. This was a civilization obsessed with the idea that justice wasn't about intention, but impact. If something caused harm, it had to pay, even if it lacked a pulse. This might sound quaint, even comical, but it also speaks to a disturbing truth. Humans will wrap ceremony around fear to make it manageable. We will invent order out of randomness, just to sleep better at night. And speaking of architectural mistakes that refuse to obey their builders, what happens when your national monument starts to fall over before it's even finished? The Leaning Tower of Pisa's early lean. When the first stones of the Tower of Pisa were laid in the 12th century, the intention was to craft a monument to civic Pridea bell tower that would stand tall beside the city's cathedral complex. What they got instead was a testament to premature celebration and extremely bad soil analysis. By the time the third story was built, the tower had already started to lean. The foundation was shallowless than 3 meters deep, and the subsoil was a soft, unstable mix of clay, sand, and shells. It couldn't hold the structure's weight, but the builders kept going. Because quitting mid-monument was apparently less embarrassing than erecting a famous architectural blunder, construction halted, resumed, halted, again spanning nearly 200 years each generation trying to fix or outsmart the tilt. Some added weight to the higher side. Others built the upper stories at an angle to compensate, giving the tower its distinctive banana-like curvature. By the time it was finished, it was a miracle it hadn't toppled over entirely. The lean became its signature. Tourists came to gawk. Artists painted it. Physicists, allegedly including Galileo, dropped objects from it. Pisa accidentally built a meme centuries before the internet. But underneath the charm is a sobering truth. It stands not because of its brilliance, but because of desperate, ongoing engineering interventions. Gravity has always had it on a watch list. And that brings us to another instance where the Earth got dramatickened, left an entire civilization wondering if they'd made the gods angry. The Great Eruption of Thera, Santorini. Around 1600 BCE, the Aegean Sea turned black with ash. The island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, exploded in one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history. The force was so great it collapsed the central part of the island, creating a caldera visible today from outer space. The explosion sent tsunamis roaring toward nearby civilizations, especially the Minoans on Crete, whose advanced society was left choking on volcanic dust and rising tides. The blast likely ejected more material than Krakatoa and blanketed the region in darkness. Entire islands disappeared under layers of ash. Crops failed. Climates shifted. Ancient cities were buried so thoroughly that only the most persistent archaeologists have found their ghostly outlines. It was as if a divine hand had pressed reset on the Mediterranean. Some believe this eruption inspired the myth of Atlantis, a thriving society swallowed by sea and hubris. Whether true or not, the destruction of Thera was a psychological rupture. It reminded even the most advanced Bronze Age peoples that nature, not man, held the final word. No walls, no rituals, no fleets of ships could stop a mountain from obliterating itself and everything nearby. What makes it particularly haunting is that it was forgotten for centuries. Oral histories warped into myth. The records, if any existed, burned or drowned. It wasn't until the 20th century that the full scale of the eruption was understood, and by then the survivors had long turned to dust. It's a reminder that even the loudest catastrophes can be swallowed by time. But if you're looking for a human-made horror with equally ruthless logic, look no further than a disciplinary system that made your best friend kill you for morale. The Roman practice of decimation. In the blood-soaked theater of Roman military discipline, few performances were more terrifying than decimation. The word itself, derived from the Latin decimus meaning tenth, conceals the brutality behind bureaucratic elegance. When a Roman legion was found guilty of cowardice, desertion, or mutiny, the punishment wasn't aimed at the guilty alone. It was aimed at everyone. The command was simple and final. Line up. Every 10th soldier steps forward. The rest form a circle. Then, using clubs, stones, or bare hands, the 9 beat the 10th to death. The goal wasn't justice. It was fear. Decimation wasn't about punishment. It was about psychological warfare turned inward. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, knowing that your fate might be sealed by a roll of the dice and that your closest friends may be ordered to kill you. Not because you failed, but because someone did. It's an ancient horror with a disturbingly modern echo, collective punishment wrapped in ceremony. Rome understood morale as a weapon, and decimation was its nuclear option. It only needed to happen once or twice in a century, for its shadow to hang over every campfire. And while decimation faded out over time, its spirit never really died. You'll find echoes of it in every top-down system that prioritizes obedience over understanding, optics over ethics. Still, if you're looking for a mystery that turns the tables entirely, something that might hint at forgotten maps, lost continents, and a little too much knowledge too early meet, a piece of parchment that shouldn't exist, the Piri Reis map. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a map of the known world. What he included on what was essentially a stitched-together piece of gazelle skin has haunted historians ever since. The map shows parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Americas. That's impressive, but explainable. What's not explainable is the southern edge, which appears to depict the northern coastline of Antarctica. Not just the icy continent, but its ice-free outline, hidden beneath glaciers for thousands of years. Antarctica wasn't even officially discovered until the 19th century, yet here it is traced out on a 16th century document with astounding accuracy. Piri Reis claimed he based his map on older sources, some going back to the time of Alexander the Great. That would be before compasses, before telescopes, before the idea that there might even be another side to the planet. And yet, the latitudes, the curvature of coastlines, the placement of land masses, it's too precise to dismiss as guesswork. Was it a fluke? A lucky draw from some long-lost mapmaker's imagination? Or is it evidence that someone, somewhere, knew far more about the world than they should have? No one agrees. Most mainstream historians dismiss it as coincidence or cartographic misinterpretation. But those explanations never fully close the door. They just make the hallway darker. And if you're still not unnerved, let's talk about what happens when millions and the rats throw a victory parade. The Black Death's impact on European fauna. When the Black Death tore through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't just decimate the human population, it cracked the continent's entire ecological shell. Entire villages vanished. Fields were abandoned, farmland became forest again. And the animals? They took back what humans had stolen. With so many people gone, the natural world surged. Wolves wandered into cities. Deer returned to farmland. Birds nested in the rafters of collapsed chapels. It was as if nature had been waiting in the wings for humanity to blink. And blink we did. But the most unsettling shift wasn't just ecological, it was psychological. Medieval Europeans, surrounded by rot and silence, saw the world transform around them. Survivors spoke of ghost towns swallowed by vines and animals that had forgotten their fear of man. In some places, it seemed as if the earth was erasing human fingerprints altogether. This strange post-plague boom disrupted everything. Economies collapsed, but peasants gained power. Land was suddenly available. Labor was in demand. Forests grew thicker. Wild boar roamed freely. It was a demographic apocalypse and a biodiversity renaissance. And behind it all, the rats, the fleas, the carriers. They fed on the dead, then fled to the next town. The human world became a banquet of corpses, and nature pulled up a chair. We think of plagues as pure destruction, but they're also resets. And the earth of history, as any guide, is more than happy to hit restart when we overstay our welcome. But if you think animals were just innocent bystanders in history's horror show, wait until you see them in court and trial, with lawyers and occasionally sentenced to death. The medieval practice of animal trials. Imagine walking into a courtroom, robes pressed, candles flickering, and in the defendant's box, a pig, or a rat, or a swarm of locusts. In medieval Europe, this wasn't satirate, was standard procedure. Animals could be charged with crimes tried under human law, assigned defense lawyers, and, if found guilty, sentenced accordingly. A pig that killed a child might be hanged. A rooster caught laying an egg clearly. A work of Satan might be burned at the stake. These weren't isolated cases. They were part of a bizarre legal tradition that spanned centuries. Entire villages once summoned weevils to court, accusing them of destroying crops. If they didn't show up, they were excommunicated, yes, banished from the grace of God. There was protocol, there were proceedings, there was paperwork. On one level, it's funny. On another, it's horrifying. These trials weren't about the animals. They were about control, about projecting human order onto a world that refused to cooperate. If a pig killed someone, the village could say, "See? Justice was done." Never mind that the pig had no malice, no moral compass, no sense of law. Justice, in this case, was theater. And sometimes, it was theology. In a world where divine will governed every sneeze and harvest, animal behavior had to be interpreted as either holy or heretical. Rats weren't just vermin, they were agents of chaos. Cows weren't just livestock, they were potential sinners. This legal menagerie eventually faded, but its spirit lingers. We still try to hold the irrational accountable, to blame storms on policies or pandemics on individual choices. Because sometimes punishing a pig is easier than admitting the system failed. Now, let's move from the absurdity of justice to the staggering mystery of human ambition into a circle of stones that refuses to explain itself. The construction of Stonehenge. Somewhere between 3000 and 2000 BCE, on a lonely field in what is now Wiltshire, England, a whole lot of someones decided to move 25-ton stones across miles of rough terrain, align them astronomically, and arrange them into a ring that would confuse every future civilization for the next 4,000 years. We call it Stonehenge, but the name does nothing to explain what it is. No one knows exactly how it was built. Theories range from dragging stones on sledges, to rolling them on logs, to wetting the ground with animal fat. The blue stones, those smaller, outer ring ones, came from Wales, over 150 miles away. That's not just ambition, that's obsession. Was it a temple? A calendar? A graveyard? A sound chamber? Every decade, new theories pop up, each more elaborate than the last, and each one collapses under the weight of its own speculation. The people who built Stonehenge left no written record, no instruction manual, just the stone sand, the shadows they cast during solstices. That's what makes it so disturbing. Not the monument itself, but the silence around it. We are staring at a miracle of prehistoric engineering, aligned to the cosmos, and we have no idea why it exists. It defies our love for explanations. It refuses to speak. Stonehenge is the ultimate anti-closure. It stands there day after day, century after century, reminding us that some human efforts aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to outlive understanding. And speaking of fiery monuments to mystery, what happens when a city burns so badly it actually heals itself? The Great Fire of London, 1666. On the night of the 2nd of September, 1666, a bakery on Pudding Lane turned into an accidental matchstick. The fire that followed didn't just consume a building, it swallowed London whole. Over 4 days, the blaze devoured 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and most of the medieval city within the walls. The heat was so intense that it melted iron, cracked stones, and turned the River Thames into a shimmering hellmouth. And yet there's a twist. The Great Fire, in all its fury, may have saved London, because just 1 year earlier, in 1665, the city had been ravaged by the last major outbreak of the bubonic plague. Tens of thousands died, and the filth-strewn alleys, flea-infested homes, and pestilent markets were ticking time bombs. The fire didn't just burn buildings, it burned rats. It burned fleas. It burned the very conditions that allowed the plague to thrive. Historians now believe the fire functioned like a scorched earth sanitation effort, a brutal, uncontrollable urban cleansing. London was rebuilt wider, cleaner, more fire-resistant, not by design, but by disaster. And here's the most ironic part. The fire that began in a bakery ended up giving London its second chance. A tragedy so complete that it looped back around to salvation. A phoenix rising from its own ashes, forced into modernity by sheer destruction. But not everyone who digs up the past finds redemption. Some open tomb sand unleash curses, or so the legends say. The curse of Tutankhamun. In 1922, Howard Carter's team uncovered the nearly untouched tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. The gold, the relics. The boy, king's funeral mask that glowed like a god frozen in time. It was one of the greatest archaeological finds in human history. And then, people started dying. The financier of the dig, Lord Carnarvon, died shortly after the tomb was opened of a mosquito bite that became infected. Within weeks, more deaths followed. Visitors, assistants, even a radiologist who had examined the mummy. Newspapers dubbed it the Curse of the Pharaohs. The idea was simple and deliciously horrifying. Disturbing the tomb had unleashed a supernatural punishment. Egyptologists dismissed the idea. They pointed to mold spores, bacteria, and coincidence. Statistically, the death rate among those involved wasn't even that abnormal. But logic has never stood a chance against fear wrapped in mystery. The curse became part of pop culture, embedding itself into the DNA of every mummy movie and tabloid headline that followed. But behind the theatrics lies something deeper. A collective guilt, perhaps, about raiding the grave of a teenage king and parading his belongings for imperial glory. The curse wasn't just about vengeance, it was about consequence. The idea that some doors, once opened, demand a price. And speaking of doors that don't open the way you think, let's pivot from sarcophagi to stadiums. Because not every Roman term means what you think it does. The Roman vomitorium. You've heard the joke. The Romans were so decadent, they built rooms specifically for vomiting during banquets so they could empty their stomachs and eat more. It's a vivid image. Togas, grapes, feathers, gluttony with architectural planning. Except it's a complete myth. A vomitorium, in Roman engineering, referred to a passageway specifically, the exit corridors in amphitheaters and stadiums that allowed crowds to spew forth rapidly after events. The term comes from the Latin vomere, meaning to discharge, not to retch up peacock tongue and wine. It had nothing to do with digestion, and everything to do with crowd control. So, how did this mix-up happen? Somewhere between bad Latin translations and Victorian moralizing, the vomitorium became a convenient symbol for Rome's supposed excess, a distorted mirror. The kind of misunderstanding that sticks, because it confirms what we already want to believe, that Rome fell because it choked on its own indulgence. But the real excess wasn't architectural, it was cultural. Rome's decline had less to do with regurgitation and more to do with rot at every level of its politics and power. The vomitorium myth persists not because it's true, but because it's easier than facing the more mundane, messier truths. And if you think that's strange, wait until you learn that ancient Egyptians didn't just mummify their people, they lovingly prepared their pets for eternity too. The ancient Egyptian practice of mummifying pets. To walk through an ancient Egyptian tomb is to enter a house built for the dead, but also for their companions. Egyptians didn't just mummify pharaohs and nobles. They mummified cats, dogs, monkeys, falcons. Even crocodiles. Sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for love. Cats, especially, were sacred. Associated with the goddess Bastet, they were guardians of the home, and the spirit. Killing a cat, even accidentally, could result in execution. So naturally, cats were embalmed with reverence and buried alongside their humans. Some were given miniature sarcophagi. Others were wrapped in elaborate linens with more care than many human burials today. But it didn't stop there. Dogs joined their masters in the afterlife. Crocodiles were mummified as offerings to Sobek, the crocodile god. Ibises were preserved by the thousands. One temple excavation found entire underground vaults filled wall to wall with animal mummy temples of eternal zoology. And yes, sometimes it was transactional. Animals were bred specifically to be killed, mummified, and sold to pilgrims as divine offerings. It was a booming industry in sacred death. Commerce in the service of belief. The idea wasn't just companionship, it was continuity. Egyptians saw the afterlife as an extension of this one. If your cat brought you comfort in life, it would bring you comfort beyond death. A kind of cosmic pet insurance. And now, from animals mummified with love, we shift to a colony that vanished without goodbye, leaving behind only a single word carved in wood. The lost colony of Roanoke. In the late 16th century, England's first attempt at a permanent colony in the New World ended not in conquest, nor in failure, but in a riddle. The settlers of Roanoke, roughly 115 men, women, and children, were dropped off on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina in 1587. Then, they disappeared, entirely, without warning, without trace. When supply ships finally returned in 1590, they found the settlement abandoned. The buildings dismantled, not destroyed. No signs of struggle, no bodies. Just one clue, the word Croton carved into a wooden post. Another carving simply read, Crow, as if the writer had been interrupted. The nearby Croatoan tribe, now Hatteras, may have offered refuge or something else, but no definitive evidence ever surfaced. Theories multiplied like spores. Some say the colonists assimilated with local tribes, intermarrying and vanishing into oral tradition. Others believe they were massacred, either by hostiles or starvation. A few suggest they tried to return to sea and were lost. There's even a fringe theory involving Spanish sabotage. But the deeper mystery is institutional. Why did no one really look for them? Why did the English crown, eager to expand its empire, so easily abandon the story? Perhaps because admitting failure was worse than silence. And silence, after all, leaves room for myth. What's more haunting than bones is the absence of them. A settlement erased, overwritten by trees and wind, and one carved word that echoes louder than any record. And while Roanoke may be gone without a trace, the plague that followed it left trails soaked in blood and fleas. The bubonic plague's origin. The Black Death didn't emerge from nowhere. Like a predator with infinite patience, it traveled. According to most historians, the bubonic plague likely originated in Central Asia, burrowed deep within the fleas that feasted on the blood of rodents. From there, it rode caravans and trade ships, moving westward along the Silk Road. Invisible, unstoppable. By the time it arrived in Europe in 1347, it had already burned through parts of China, the Middle East, and North Africa. But Europe, with its densely packed cities, bad hygiene, and love of blaming minorities, was the perfect feeding ground. Rats hopped aboard merchant ships, fleas hopped aboard rats, and the bacteria Yersinia pestis hopped aboard the human race. The disease moved faster than belief systems could adjust. People dropped dead in hours. Whole families died overnight. Doctors bled patients, burned herbs, prayed, and wept. Nothing worked. Priests fled their flocks. Parents abandoned children. It was the apocalypse, not with trumpets, but with coughs and black boils. But what remains disturbing is how little people understood it, and how ready they were to blame anything but reality. Jews were scapegoated, witches were burned, foreigners were expelled. all while the fleas simply moved on. Even today, plague strains still exist in the wild, in labs, even in modern cases. It's not entirely gone, just quieter. And if you think plague-driven madness is grim, wait until you meet the Roman emperor who thought the arena was a great place for performance reviews. The Roman emperor, Commodus's gladiator obsession. Commodus didn't just inherit the Roman Empire, he treated it like a stage. The son of Marcus Aurelius, he took power in 180 AD and immediately began eroding everything his philosopher king father had built. Rome, to Commodus, wasn't a republic or a state. It was a Colosseum, and he was its star. He fancied himself a god, a second Hercules. He ordered statues sculpted with his face on the hero's body, club in hand, lion skin draped over shoulders. And then he went further. He became a gladiator. Not symbolically, literally. He fought in the arena, repeatedly. His opponents? Often wounded soldiers, slaves, or animals. The outcomes were prearranged. The blood was real. The threat was not. But Commodus loved the cheers, the costumes, the myth of his invincibility. He charged Rome vast sums to watch him perform, bankrupting the treasury while the empire's borders frayed. The Senate was horrified. Gladiators were entertainers, not emperors. Commodus blurred the lines, undermining the dignity of the office, turning divine rule into parody. Eventually, even his inner circle had enough. He was strangled to death by a wrestler named Narcissus, ending his reign in the very spirit he adored like a final, grotesque match. Commodus is remembered not for leadership, but for spectacle. He ruled like a madman with a fan base. Rome, by then, was already cracking. He just gave it a reason to collapse a little faster. And from theatrical madness to sculpted mystery, we now turn our gaze to stone heads as large as vans, carved by hands we barely understand. The mystery of the Olmec colossal heads. Dotting the jungles of modern-day Mexico, half buried in foliage and time, sit the remnants of one of the most enigmatic ancient civilizations in the Americaste Olmecs. And standing, or more often slumped and sunken, are their most famous works, the colossal heads, towering stone sculptures, some over 9 feet tall and weighing more than 20 tons, each carved with distinctive facial features, lips pursed, brows furrowed, helmets carved in stylized fashion, as if ready for war or ritual. No one knows exactly why these heads were made. The Olmecs left no written explanation. Some believe they were portraits of rulers, immortalized in basalt. Others suggest warriors, gods, or symbolic avatars of power. Whatever they are, they weren't casual projects. The nearest quarries were dozens of miles away. That means the Olmecs somehow transported multi-ton stones through jungles, across rivers, and into ceremonial plazasol without wheels or draft animals. What's disturbing isn't just the scale of effort, it's the singularity of the obsession. These heads are monolithic devotion chiseled from volcanic rock. Not a single body has been found to match the heads, just faces. As if the Olmec memory was meant to be faceless bodies forgotten, but heads alone revered. Some of the heads have been moved, others lie tilted, eyes gazing into undergrowth, caught mid-thought for eternity. They're not just ancient, they're watching. And speaking of ancient traditions that demand your full exposure, let's talk about a sporting event where nudity wasn't a scandal, but a uniform. The ancient Olympic Games nudity. The original Olympic Games, founded in 776 BCE, were not for the faint of heart or for anyone shy about body image. The ancient Greeks believed in celebrating physical perfection through total transparency. Athletes competed completely naked, not partially, not symbolically, entirely. This wasn't out of perversion or shock value. To the Greeks, nudity was pure. It showcased the form, symmetry, and strength of the male body. In a world that merged athleticism with spirituality, The body was a templand. Temples don't wear pants. Events included wrestling, running, discus, and javelin, all done under the sun, skin to sky. There was even a linguistic marker. The Greek word gymnasium comes from gymnos, meaning naked. Gymnasiums weren't just places for exercise, they were sacred grounds for stripping down the ego, the cloth, and the skin. Only free-born Greek men were allowed to compete. Women were banned from participation and largely from spectating. Except for a rare few priestesses, female presence was an offense punishable by death. So while the men showcased their divine design, the women stayed away, or else. The disturbing part? Not the nudity, but how easily society drew the line between celebration and exclusion. The Olympics were a paradox open to the few, closed to the many. An elite ritual cloaked in sweat and sunburn. Now picture that same moral rigidity turned back on marble itself when a statue falls on a man, and suddenly it becomes the criminal. The Roman practice of executing statues. In ancient Rome, if a statue fell and killed someone, it could be tried for murder. Yes, tried. In court. With witnesses, arguments, and sentencing. Because in Rome, guilt wasn't just a matter of intent, it was a matter of consequence. If a slab of carved stone tipped over and crushed a citizen, someone or something had to answer for it. And if no person could be blamed, the statue was condemned. Some were destroyed. Others were exiled, literally dragged out of the city and left in disgrace. It sounds like theater, and it was. But like all Roman theater, it was political. These weren't just accidents. They were opportunities. A statue topples? Maybe it was an omen. Maybe it symbolized divine wrath. Maybe it was just a good excuse to erase the past. Rome didn't treat its monuments as passive objects. They were symbols of power, pride, and propaganda. And when one turned deadly, even by gravity's indifferent hand, it became a liability. To do nothing would be to tempt the gods, or worse, public opinion. This practice extended beyond statues. If a building collapsed and killed people, the builder could be executed. Rome didn't do disclaimers. If you made it, you were responsible. And in a society where monuments were the message, punishing one was a statement. It wasn't just about stone, it was about who controlled the story the stone told. Which makes the next story even more chilling. A war not fought on land, but on ice, with history skating on the thinnest of surfaces. The Battle of the Ice, 1242. In 1242, war slipped and skidded its way into history on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, where the Teutonic Knights, a military order with crusading ambitions, met the army of Novgorod, led by Prince Alexander Nevsky. What followed was not just a clash of medieval ideologies, but one of geography, physics, and thinly veiled divine comedy. The Teutonic Knights, armored head to toe and confident in their holy mandate, charged across the frozen lake with all the subtlety of an iron avalanche. They expected resistance. They got nature. Nevsky's forces, lighter, nimbler, and more familiar with the terrain, baited the knights onto the ice, where their sheer weight became their downfall, quite literally. The ice cracked, horses slipped, soldiers plunged into the frigid water below, metal turning into an anchor. What was meant to be a decisive blow against Russian orthodoxy became a slow, wet death for many would-be crusaders. The lake swallowed them, and with them, their cause. It was not just a battle, it was a spectacle. Later romanticized in film and folklore, especially by Soviet cinema, it became a parable of underdog resistance and environmental revenge. But the disturbing truth hides in the details. A military campaign turned into a frozen tomb, and a victory forged as much by ice as by sword. Now, from warriors trapped beneath the ice to a woman who vanished into the sky, let's leap forward to a disappearance that launched 1,000 conspiracies. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart, 1937. She was the face of fearless aviation, the woman who challenged a sky that still looked down on women. Amelia Earhart wasn't just a pilot, she was a symbol, soaring through a male-dominated field with charm, grit, and a disarming smile. But in 1937, during an ambitious attempt to circumnavigate the globe, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanished over the Pacific. One radio transmission, one vague location, then nothing. The search was massive. Theories multiplied. Maybe they crashed and sank. Maybe they landed on an uninhabited island. Maybe, according to the more fantastical corners of the human psyche, they were captured by the Japanese or lived out their days under new identities. Decades passed. Bones were found. Skeletal fragments studied. Radio logs re-examined. But the mystery remained. No plane, no body, no closure. What makes Earhart's disappearance so disturbing isn't just the loss. It's the way it blurs the line between myth and reality. We remember her not only for what she did, but for what she might have done if. It's the ultimate freeze frame. A life paused at the edge of history, just before the landing. And perhaps that's why we keep looking. Because she represents more than a missing plane. She's our collective need for resolution made flesh. But in this story, resolution never landed. Now, from one body never found to bodies preserved by nature in grotesque perfection meet the dead who refuse to decay. Still with us? Impressive most people tap out around plague number 2. If you're the kind who likes your history with a side of existential dread, make sure to subscribe. And tell us, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Are you wrapped in blankets in New Zealand, or wide awake at 2 a.m. in Detroit? We're all in this rabbit hole together. The bog bodies of Northern Europe. They emerge from peat bogs like forgotten thoughts, perfectly preserved in their final moments. Skin leathered, fingernails intact, hair still clinging to the scalp. The bog bodies of Northern Europe, some dating back over 2,000 years, are time travelers with no names, their deaths sealed in water and soil. What's chilling isn't just how well preserved they are, it's how they died. Many show signs of violent ends: strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning. Some have ropes still around their necks. Others were pinned down with wooden stakes. These weren't ordinary burials. They were executions, sacrifices, ritualistic murders performed in the name of gods, seasons, or something darker we can only guess. And yet, they lie there, in the mud, caught in a chemical embrace that preserved their last breath. The bog, rich in sphagnum moss and acidity, halts decay like a suspended sentence, a punishment locked in amber. They weren't buried with honor. They weren't marked for remembrance. They were thrown in, silenced. But the bog, like history itself, had other plans. It exhumed them centuries later to haunt us with their stories, or rather, their lack of them. The bog bodies are a paradox, dead yet expressive, voiceless yet eloquent. They whisper from the wetlands, not about who they were, but about who we are. About how easily civilization wraps cruelty in ceremony and calls it sacred. And if you're unsettled by murder hidden in nature's embrace, wait until you meet the emperor who sang love songs while the empire burned and called it art. The Roman Emperor Nero's artistic ambitions. Nero didn't want to rule an empire, he wanted to star in one. Crowned emperor at 16, he wasn't satisfied with power, armies, or the machinery of state. What he craved was applause. Rome, to him, was less a republic than a captive audience. He played the lyre, recited poetry, acted in his own plays. He forced senators, nobles, and foreign dignitaries to endure his performances, not out of appreciation but obligation. To criticize was treason. To yawn was rebellion. He considered himself a Renaissance man centuries before the Renaissance had a marketing team. Nero didn't just dabble in the arts, he demanded validation. Whole amphitheaters filled with people who knew the only proper response was thunderous clapping. Meanwhile, the empire frayed at the seams. And when the Great Fire of Rome broke out in 64 AD, devouring much of the city, rumors swirled that Nero had ordered it himself to make way for his new palace complex, the Domus Aurea. The opulence was staggering. The halls glittered with gold leaf. The ceilings rotated. The fountains sprayed perfume. It was a musician's fantasy built on the ashes of the city. Whether or not Nero played music while Rome burned is debatable, but the legend clings because it feels emotionally accurate. He was the emperor who turned tragedy into a backdrop for performance. His reign ended, unsurprisingly, in disgrace and suicide, his final words reportedly being, "What an artist dies in me." It's tempting to laugh until you realize how often power disguises itself as culture and madness wears the mask of creativity. From gilded ceilings to clay shelves, let's descend now into an ancient library where stories were etched in stone and some were deliberately shattered. The Library of Ashurbanipal. Long before Alexandria was collecting scrolls, Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was hoarding knowledge in Nineveh. His library, established in the 7th century BCE, was no quaint book nook. It was a fortress of information. Over 30,000 clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script, covering medicine, astronomy, rituals, myths, and administrative records, including the oldest known copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, tale of gods, kings, and existential dread. But this wasn't just for reading pleasure. It was imperial control through information. Knowledge in Ashurbanipal's hands was political. By preserving foreign texts and translating enemy lore, he was turning wisdom into a weapon. The tablets weren't just texts, they were trophies. And when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, many of the tablets were deliberately broken, shattered not by time, but by conquest. It wasn't enough to burn buildings. The knowledge had to be silenced. The stories killed. And in a grim twist of archaeology, these shattered tablets survived better than intact ones because clay fragments don't burn the way papyrus does. Today, scholars painstakingly reassemble them like ancient jigsaw puzzles, deciphering fragments of forgotten empires. But some tablets remain partially unread, their meaning sealed by time and fractures. What's missing may never be recovered. The Library of Ashurbanipal is a graveyard of intention. It reminds us that information, once weaponized, becomes dangerous to both sides. And when knowledge is no longer convenient, destruction becomes the final edit. From broken tablets to broken peakslets, now look at a monument that still stands tall, despite losing its literal crowning glory. The Great Pyramid of Giza's missing capstone. Of all the ancient wonders, the Great Pyramid of Giza remains the last one standing, a 4,500-year-old enigma, built with such precision that modern engineers still scratch their heads. But if you look closely or just look up, you'll notice something odd. It's missing its tip. The capstone, once believed to be a polished pyramidion of gold or electrum, is gone. No one knows exactly when it disappeared or how. Was it removed during an earthquake? Stolen by tomb robbers? Chiseled off during a medieval renovation turned demolition? Its absence turns the pyramid into a sentence without a period statement of perfection left unfinished. The capstone wasn't just decorative. Symbolically, it completed the pyramid, aligning it with solar worship and possibly functioning as a literal beacon. Without it, the structure feels decapitated. A throne without a crown, a god missing its halo. What's disturbing is that the pyramid still dominates the landscape, still draws awe, and yet it's incomplete. And maybe that's the real message. The ancients weren't just building tombs, they were building puzzles. And sometimes, the missing piece isn't an accident. It's the final lesson. A monument doesn't need to be whole to be powerful. Sometimes, What's absent is what holds your attention. And with that, let's plunge into medieval justice again, where innocence or guilt was determined not by reason or evidence, but by fire, water, and the whims of the divine. The medieval trial by ordeal. In the Middle Ages, guilt or innocence wasn't always a matter for reason debated, was a matter for God. And to consult him, Europeans turned to the spectacle of trial by ordeal, a legal system so absurd it might as well have been dreamt up by a bored sadist with a flair for drama. If you were accused of a crime and couldn't prove your innocence, the court would let divine intervention decide. There were options. You could carry a red-hot iron bar across a set distance, then have your burns inspected days later. If they were healing well, you were innocent. If not, God had spoken. Alternatively, you might be bound and thrown into a body of water. If you floated, you were guilty because the holy water was rejecting your sinful flesh. If you sank, congratulations, innocent and possibly dead. There were also versions involving boiling water, firewalking, or ingesting poison. It wasn't about evidence, it was about spectacle and submission. The logic was theological. God would protect the innocent, even from physical harm. But in practice, it was a rigged system steeped in fear and deeply reliant on the physical suffering of the accused. What's most disturbing isn't that these ordeals existed, but that people believed in them. They were culturally accepted, morally justified, and even requested by the accused, who sometimes saw it as their only hope of escape. Eventually, the church and secular courts phased out the practice, partly because it was horrifying, and partly because even divine PR has limits. But the idea that pain can purify, that suffering reveals truth, that hasn't gone anywhere. And while bodies were boiled and burned in Europe, across the desert another ancient civilization was performing ceremonies to wake the dead with rituals that opened mouths and whispered to eternity. The ancient Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't an end, it was a transition, but the afterlife required functionality, eyes to see, ears to hear, a tongue to speak the names of gods. And so, the Egyptians invented a ritual to prepare the deceased for their new journey, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. Priests performed the rite on both mummies and statues, using specially crafted tools often shaped like fish hooks or bladesto touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and limbs of the deceased. The belief was that these actions would restore the senses, allowing the dead to eat, breathe, pray, and communicate in the afterlife. The ceremony was deeply theatrical. Incantations were chanted, symbolic gestures mimicked rebirth, sacrifices might be made. Everything followed a sacred script that hadn't changed in centuries. It was not just religious, it was technological, a metaphysical reboot for the soul. What's haunting is how systematically the Egyptians mapped the transition from life to death. It wasn't chaotic, it was engineered. Death had a process, and that process was bureaucratically sacred. And this wasn't a fringe practice, it was core to Egyptian funerary belief. Kings, nobles, and even commoners, if they could afford it all, underwent versions of the ritual. The afterlife wasn't for everyone, it was for the prepared. Even now, archaeologists uncover mummies with tools placed carefully beside them like boarding passes for the underworld, as if, even in death, you better have your paperwork ready. But speaking of walls that divided the living from the chaos beyond, let's now travel north, to a wall so massive it split a country, and whose stones still whisper of empire and fear. The Roman Emperor Hadrian's Wall. Stretching across the narrow waste of Great Britain, Hadrian's Wall was Rome's line in the dirt, a declaration that civilization ended here and barbarism began there. Commissioned by Emperor Hadrian around 122 AD, it was more than just a defensive fortification, it was a message. The wall spanned roughly 73 miles, fortified with mile castles, observation towers, and garrisons. Built by Roman soldiers, it cut through hills, forests, and farmlands. The official explanation? To keep out the unruly tribes of the north, particularly the Picts. But practically, it was also a checkpoint, a control valve for movement, trade, and imperial authority. It was never meant to be impenetrable. Raiders still crossed it. Wars still happened. But the wall made a statement. This far, no further. A psychological boundary as much as a physical one. What's eerie is how much of it still stands. Moss-covered stones tracing the landscape like a scar, reminding everyone that even ancient superpowers built fences when they ran out of confidence. The wall wasn't just about defense, it was about decline. Rome was no longer expanding, it was bracing. And for all its strength, the wall didn't save the empire. The borders shifted, the soldiers left, and the stones were repurposed into churches and farms. But Hadrian's message endures in every boundary we still build, between countries, ideologies, and identities. And now, from walls that divided to lines that misdefetched in desert soil by hands that may have been reaching for the sky, or just drawing in the sand to be remembered. The mystery of the Nazca lines. In the blistering desert plains of southern Peru, stretching for miles across arid ground, lie massive geoglyphs that have puzzled archaeologists and mystics alike, the Nazca lines. Drawn between 500 BCE and 500 CE by the Nazca culture, these enormous figures depict animals, plants, and geometric patterns, some so large they can only be fully appreciated from the sky. But there's the first problem. The Nazca people didn't have flight. So why draw something no one could view? Theories abound. Some say the lines were ritual pathways meant to be walked as part of religious ceremonies. Others believe they were astronomical calendars tracking solstices and star positions. Then come the more fantastical ideas: alien runways, coded messages to the gods, or maps to underground water sources. The truth? No one knows. What's especially strange is the precision. These weren't casual doodles. The lines are laser straight, the curves deliberate. Even today, creating something this large and accurate without aerial perspective would be a logistical nightmare. But the Nazca pulled it off, over and over, with only sticks, stones, and a staggering sense of scale. And somehow, the lines endured. The desert's dryness preserved them, while isolation kept them hidden. They were only rediscovered in the 20th century by people flying overhead. The disturbing part isn't just the mystery, it's the motivation. These were not monuments of ego or war. They were made for someone or something else to see. That's what lingers, the idea of a message meant for the sky. Now, from lines in the sand to wheels of death, let's rewind to one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history, where thousands clashed in dust, blood, and broken treaties. The Battle of Kadesh, c. 1274 BCE. In the heat-blasted plains near the Orontes River, two ancient superpowers collided in a thunder of hooves, spears, and diplomatic backstabbing. The Battle of Kadesh, fought between Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt and King Muwatalli II of the Hittite Empire, was not just a war, it was a message carved in bronze. Somewhere, between 5,000 and 6,000 chariots, possibly more, turned the battlefield into a crashing, whirling nightmare of speed and splintered limbs. It was the largest known chariot battle in history, what today we might call an ancient arms race on wheels. The Egyptians claimed victory. Ramesses had inscriptions carved boasting of his personal heroism, single-handedly turning the tide against overwhelming odds. But the Hittites also walked away and regrouped. So did Egypt really win? Or did they just write the better press release? What's unnerving is how modern the whole thing feels. Propaganda, half-truths, spin. Each side declared success, even as the body count suggested otherwise. Eventually, they signed one of the first known peace treaties in history, a stone inscription of mutual exhaustion. But the scars remained. The battle had been sparked by territorial greed, miscommunication, and espionage, and even after peace was declared, trust never followed. The peace was more ceasefire than harmony. And now, from battlefields to bizarre punishments, let's slide into the cruel theater of medieval misogyny, where silence was not golden, but enforced with iron. The medieval practice of scold's bridle. In a world where words could get you burned, whipped, or branded, medieval society came up with a torture device specifically designed to suppress women's speech, the scold's bridle. Also known as the brank, it was a metal cage fitted over the head, often with a plate or spike inserted into the mouth to suppress the tongue. It was used on women accused of being scolds, a label that could mean anything from nagging a husband to voicing an opinion. The device was often locked in place and paraded through towns. Shame was the punishment, pain was the bonus, crowds jeered, stones were thrown, and the woman's offense? Speaking. This wasn't fringe behavior, was codified in law in parts of Britain and Europe. The bridle symbolized the fear of unruly femininity, of women who didn't stay silent or obedient. It was a punishment for voice, for volume, for defiance. Sometimes, the bridle was decorated ironically with grotesque masks or bells to draw more attention. The torture was as psychological as it was physical, humiliation as a form of control. A medieval meme shared publicly, etched in iron and spite. What's disturbing isn't just the existence of such a device, but the cultural comfort around it. The fact that entire communities normalized this spectacle speaks volumes about what they feared most: a woman with something to say. And now, from symbolic silencing to mysterious thunder from the zealot's dive into the chaos brought by an unidentified enemy whose name still rattles ancient records: the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples' invasions. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean plunged into darkness, not metaphorically, but socially, politically, economically. Cities burned, empires collapsed, writing systems vanished. And at the epicenter of this storm were the Sea Peoples, a confederation of mysterious maritime raiders who emerged, seemingly from nowhere, to wreak havoc across Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece. They came in waves. They came with fire, and they left a trail of shattered civilizations. No one knows exactly who they were. They appear in Egyptian inscriptions as a list of strange tribal names: the Peliset, the Shurden, the Luca. Some theories claim they were displaced Mycenaeans. Others say Proto-Philistines, or refugees from ecological collapse and famine. Their motives remain as murky as their origins. Pharaoh Ramesses III claimed to have repelled their assault in Egypt, depicting the battle on massive stone reliefs with typical Egyptian flair. But even victory wasn't enough to stop the tide. The late Bronze Age world, a network of kingdoms linked by trade, treaties, and political marriages, was obliterated in less than a century. Hattusa, Ugarit, Mycenae fell. What's disturbing isn't just the violence, it's the speed and scale of erasure. Within a generation, scribes stopped writing, traders stopped sailing, art became simpler, palaces became ruins. The world regressed, and nobody left instructions. And then, in true haunting fashion, the Sea Peoples disappeared from the historical record as suddenly as they arrived. And while civilizations were collapsing on one end of the world, another was finding creative ways to rewrite memory with hammers and chisels. The Roman concept of damnatio memoriae. In ancient Rome, death wasn't always the end. Sometimes, it was just the beginning of a second, more brutal form of punishment: erasure. Damnatio memoriae, literally, condemnation of memory, was the Roman state's method of unmaking a person. When someone fell dramatically out of favor, usually an emperor, senator, or general, they weren't merely executed. They were deleted. Their statues were smashed, their names scratched from inscriptions, their portraits defaced. Coins were reminted, documents revised, public records purged. It was state-sanctioned oblivion. A ritual designed not just to punish the dead, but to humiliate them across eternity. The logic was poetic in its cruelty. If the Roman state could not tolerate your legacy, it would unwrite your existence. It wasn't enough to kill the body, you had to kill the memory. It was the ultimate power move, history rewritten in real time, with vengeance as its editor. But of course, the irony is that damnatio memoria rarely worked. The very act of erasure preserved the story. Historians would mark the blank spaces, note the destroyed images, whisper the redacted names. The attempt to forget became unforgettable. Modern tyrants would take notes, trying their own versions of historical redaction books burned, photos altered, rivals photoshopped out. But the ghost of Rome lingers in all of it, proof that memory, even when beaten and buried, refuses to stay quiet. And from a forgotten legacy to an entire civilization that walked off history's stage, we now turn to the ancient cities of the Maya vanished, abandoned, and echoing with questions no one can quite answer. The disappearance of the Maya civilization. The Maya weren't a single kingdom, but a constellation of city-states spread across present-day Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. They built towering pyramids, mapped the stars with precision rivaling modern telescopes, and developed a writing system that spoke in symbols and stories. For centuries, they flourished until they didn't. Sometime around the 9th century CE, something changed. The great cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Copan, Palenquere, gradually abandoned. Temples were left unfinished, ball courts overgrown. Glyphs went unwritten, the jungle crept back in. Unlike the fall of Rome or the razing of Troy, there was no single climactic event. No conquering army, no fiery end. Just a slow, almost polite exodus. Theories range from internal warfare, environmental degradation, prolonged droughts, to elite mismanagement. It may have been all of them, or none. The truth remains buried beneath centuries of moss and mystery. What's even more unsettling is that the Maya didn't vanish completely. The civilization fragmented, migrated, morphed. Northern cities like Chichen Itza continued for a time. And today, millions of Maya descendants still live in Central America, speaking Mayan languages and preserving traditions. So what disappeared wasn't the people, it was their urban heartbeat, their monumental rhythm, their architectural confidence, and the question of why still hangs like mist over their abandoned cities. From carved stone calendars to whispered forest ruins, the Maya left behind a warning that even the most advanced civilizations can simply stop. And if you think writing curses into history is strange, wait until you see what happens when those curses are written onto metal and buried where only the gods might hear. The ancient Egyptian practice of cursed tablets. When vengeance couldn't be shouted, it was whispered into clay, into lead, into the underworld. Ancient Egyptians, with their obsession for the afterlife and cosmic justice, also found time for petty grudges. The medium, curse tablets. Small pieces of lead or clay inscribed with maledictions, aimed squarely at enemies, rivals, thieves, unfaithful lovers. Anyone unfortunate enough to cross the wrong person with access to a scribe and a little dark creativity. These tablets weren't just written, they were deployed, slipped into tombs, buried in cemeteries, hidden beneath thresholds, or dropped into sacred rivers. The logic was simple. By placing the curse near the realm of the dead, you enlisted otherworldly forces to do your bidding. It was a divine hit job, wrapped in religious formality. Some curses were astonishingly detailed. They named their targets, they listed offenses, they specified the kind of suffering requested. Illness, failure, heartbreak. And the most unnerving part? These weren't the tools of illiterate peasants. They were often created by priests, elites, people who believed in the system of divine balance, but weren't above stacking the odds. It's one thing to believe in justice. It's another to subcontract it to the dead. But the Egyptians weren't alone in this practice. The Romans would soon pick up the same dark hobby, only with more flair and a touch more venom. The Roman practice of defictiones, curse tablets. In Rome, revenge was an art form, and like all Roman arts, it came with documentation. The defictiones, or Roman curse tablets, were the graffiti of divine vengeances scratched onto thin sheets of lead, often pierced with nails, folded, and deposited in graves, wells, or temples. The content ranged from the personal, "May Gaius lose all his teeth and suffer eternal constipation," to the competitive, "Bind the hands and tongue of the charioteer Flavius so he crashes in disgrace." These curses weren't whispers, they were angry scrolls, calling upon gods, spirits, and demons to intervene directly in mortal affairs. What's most chilling is the routine nature of it. Curse tablets weren't rare. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds, thousands, even scattered throughout the Roman world. In Bath, England, curses were hurled into sacred springs. In Athens, they lined graves. In North Africa, they were wrapped around figurines and stabbed. People cursed for love, for money, for sport. And unlike public legal systems, the curse tablet required no proof, no witnesses, just belief. Belief that the gods would listen, or that someone else's suffering could buy back a sense of control. And while defictiones were technically illegal in some eras, enforcement was laughable. After all, how do you arrest a lead sheet buried in a crypt? In these silent invocations we find something deeply Roman, control cloaked as mysticism, justice turned private, faith weaponized. And sometimes, those weapons left a mark so grotesque that even thousands of years later, it still screams in silence. The screaming mummy. In a land obsessed with perfect preservation and eternal stillness, one mummy refused to play along. Unearthed in the late 19th century and nicknamed the Screaming Mummy, this corpse was found with mouth agape in a twisted rictus of apparent agony. Wrapped in unceremonious linens, buried without honor or the usual funerary decorum, it looked more like a cautionary tale than a kingly relic. Was he screaming, dying mid-howl? Or did the muscles simply lock in place as rigor mortis set in, the jaw falling open before mummification? Some suggest he was poisoned, others that he was buried alive. One theory points to him being Prince Pentawerison of Ramesses III, who allegedly conspired to assassinate his father and was subsequently forced to commit suicide as punishment. If true, this would be one of the few physical remnants of a royal scandal preserved not just in papyrus, but in flesh. Unlike his fellow mummies, this one received no gilded mask, no inscriptions, no protective amulets, just a tomb of disgrace and a face that couldn't forget. His open mouth became a metaphor, a mute scream across millennia. To this day, the screaming mummy draws more speculation than almost any other, because in a culture that went to great lengths to make death look serene, this one body tells a different story. One of terror, or defiance, or pain so profound, it ruptured even the rituals of eternity. And from one man's haunted silence, we pivot back to fire, and Blamato, the moment when Nero, flames still licking the sky, turned history into performance and Christians into scapegoats. The Great Fire of Rome, 64 AD, and Christian persecution. It began in the dead of night. On the 18th of July, 64 AD, fire broke out in the merchant shops lining the Circus Maximus. It spread with terrifying speed, devouring neighborhoods, temples, and marketplaces. Rome burned for 9 days. Of its 14 districts, only 4 escaped damage. 3 were reduced entirely to ash. The rest bore deep scars. Emperor Nero, whose name has since become synonymous with this inferno, was away in Antium when the fire started. Upon return, he offered aid, opened his gardens for the displaced, distributed food. But the rumors swirled like smoke, that he had ordered the fire himself, that he watched it from a tower, singing of Troy as Rome burned. Whether true or not, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a new, strange sect, the Christians. They were already unpopular, accused of atheism for refusing to worship Roman gods, and cannibalism for their secretive Eucharist rituals. Nero's accusations were a death sentence. Christians were rounded up, tortured, crucified, and burned alive to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. It was the first state-sponsored persecution of Christians, and it set a grim precedent. The irony? Nero's punishment of Christians ensured their martyrdom would be immortalized. In trying to erase them, he gave them a narrative heroes of faith, crushed by tyranny. The fire scarred Rome, but it branded Nero forever. The witch hunts of early modern Europe. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, Europe lost its collective mind. Not all at once, but in waves of hysteria, sharpened by theology and inflamed by fear. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and executed, burned, drowned, hanged, tortured into confessions that echoed with screams louder than any sermon. These weren't isolated incidents. They were epidemics of moral panic, sanctioned by both church and state. In towns and cities across Germany, France, Scotland, and beyond, neighbors turned on neighbors. A dead cow, a failed harvest, a sudden illness, all could be traced back to someone with the look. Women who lived alone, who knew herbs, who spoke too much or too little, became suspects. The legal systems didn't help. Torture was not only permitted, it was institutionalized. Under agony, people confessed to flying through the night, having sex with the devil, casting spells from soup bones and cat hair. These confessions were used to convict others, who in turn named more names, pulling entire communities into an expanding vortex of accusation. And let's not pretend it was all superstition. Witch hunts were also social warfare, convenient tools to remove the inconvenient. A way to settle debts, enforce conformity, and crush resistance, especially female resistance. The disturbing part isn't just the executions, it's how ordinary they became, how easily horror slips into procedure. And from the flames of mass delusion, we pivot to a mystery baked into clay, written in a language no one speaks, in spirals no one has deciphered. The mystery of the Phaistos disc. Unearthed in 1908 on the island of Crete, the Phaistos disc is a palm-sized enigma. Made of fired clay, and dating back to roughly 1700 BCE, the disc is covered with 241 symbols arranged in a spiral, pressed into the surface with carved stamps. It's one of the earliest examples of movable type, and yet we have no idea what it says. The symbols are neither Greek nor Linear A, nor any known writing system. They depict humans, animals, tools, and abstract shapes, each repeated in patterns that suggest grammar, but defy translation. The disc isn't long enough to offer much linguistic context. It may be a hymn, a prayer, a legal document, or even a board game. We simply don't know. What makes it more disturbing is that it's alone. There's no library of other discs to compare it with. No Rosetta Stone, no bilingual key. Just one disc, one puzzle, one whisper from a civilization that's long since vanished into sea and myth. Theories flourish, of course. Some say it's a relic of the Minoans. Others think it's a hoax. But the artifact's authenticity has stood the test of decades. What hasn't stood, however, is our confidence in cracking it. The Phaistos disc isn't just unread, it mocks our hunger for narrative. It sits in a museum, taunting every scholar who walks past with its stubborn silence, a story that refuses to be told. And if you're looking for closure, it offers none, just concentric circles of mystery, stamped into clay, spinning forever in a language we may never hear. The Roman Emperor, Commodus's death by strangling. It takes a certain type of emperor to outlive his own absurdity. But Commodus, ever the performer, couldn't resist turning his assassination into a twisted final act. By 192 AD, Rome was tired. Tired of his vanity, his gladiator fantasies, his demands to be worshipped as a living god. The Senate plotted. His concubine Marcia joined them. His chamberlain turned traitor. But when poison failed to do the job, Commodus vomited it up more. Direct measures were needed. Enter Narcissus, a professional wrestler turned imperial hitman. The plan was as brutal as it was efficient. Narcissus was sent into Commodus's private quarters, likely under the guise of a training session or massage. There, in the steam of the bathhouse, he strangled the emperor, perhaps with his own hands, perhaps with a cord. The body was unceremoniously disposed of, and Rome promptly erased Commodus's name from public monuments. Another round of damnatio memoriae? Another god-king discarded? What's eerie is how fitting his death was. Commodus, who had once staged gladiatorial matches with disabled opponents and demanded applause for fake victories, died in a fight he didn't even know he was in. His reign ended not with fire or invasion, but with silence, steam, and a wrestler's grip. And from one hole in the skull to many, let's explore an ancient medical procedure that makes medieval dentistry look like spa therapy. The practice of trepanning. It sounds like something out of a horror film. Ancient surgeons drilling holes into the human skull without anesthesia to let out. What exactly? Spirits, pressure, madness? The practice of trepanning or trepanation dates back thousands of years, appearing in prehistoric Europe, Mesoamerica, Africa, and Asia. A small section of the skull was cut, scraped, or bored away, creating a literal window into the brain. And yet, it wasn't always fatal. In fact, many trepan skulls show signs of healing, indicating the patients survived sometimes multiple procedures. The reasons vary. In some cultures, it was believed to release evil spirits. In others, it was used to treat head injuries, relieve swelling, or cure epilepsy and migraines. It might have even had ceremonial purposes: initiations, spiritual enhancements, or status symbols. What's most unsettling isn't the procedure itself, it's the survival rate. The technique was surprisingly effective. In some regions, ancient trepanners had better survival outcomes than Civil War-era battlefield surgeons. The precision, cleanliness, and post-op care challenge our assumptions about primitive medicine. But then again, the idea of opening a skull with a flint blade and no sedation still sends modern minds reeling. It's the kind of treatment that sounds like torture, yet may have offered real relief. Today, trepanation is mostly a historical curiositex, except for the rare cases of modern enthusiasts drilling their own skulls in the belief it brings mental clarity. Yes, that's still a thing. Apparently, the line between medicine and madness is a hole in the head wide enough to crawl through. And now, from open skulls to open borders, brace yourself for the great migrations that helped topple an empire. The Great Migration of Germanic tribes. Between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, the Roman Empire found itself under siege not from a single enemy, but from a tidal wave of displaced peoples, the Germanic tribes. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, Angles, Saxons, names that would soon become the roots of future nations, but in Rome's final centuries, they were synonymous with chaos. This wasn't just invasion, it was exodus, a mass movement of entire populations driven by famine, political pressure, and the encroaching threat of the Huns from the east. Some tribes sought asylum within Roman borders, others demanded land. Many, when refused or mistreated, turned to violence. The most infamous episode? The Visigoths sacking Rome in 410 AD, an event so shocking that Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, declared, The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer invincible. The migrations didn't end there. The Vandals crossed into North Africa. The Ostrogoths carved out a kingdom in Italy. The Anglo-Saxons reshaped Britain. Each wave eroded what was left of centralized Roman power, until the Western Empire was a hollow shell filled with fading Latin and the smoke of former glory. The disturbing part is how inevitable it all seems in retrospect. The empire had become bloated, corrupt, and fragile. The borders were long, the loyalty short. And so, civilization didn't collapse with a bang, it was walked over, one tribe at a time. From there, Europe would spend centuries reassembling itself from the pieces and inventing new ways to exile threats, some by sword, others with a vote and a broken shard of pottery. The ancient Greek practice of ostracism. In the golden age of Athenian democracy, exile wasn't just punishment, it was policy. Once a year, citizens gathered to vote on whether anyone among them had grown too powerful, too popular, or simply too unsettling. If the answer was yes, they would scratch that person's name onto a shard of pottery, called an ostracon. If the name appeared enough times, the target was banished for 10 years. No trial, no debate, just consensus. This wasn't necessarily about guilt. Ostracism was preemptive, not punitive. You didn't have to commit a crime, just make people nervous. The idea was to prevent tyranny by ejecting potential tyrants before they had the chance to consolidate power. In theory, it was democratic self-defense. In practice, it was often a popularity contest with razor blades. Even prominent figures like Themistocles and Aristides weren't immune. Themistocles, the celebrated naval hero of the Persian Wars, was ostracized once his influence became uncomfortable. Aristides, known as the Just, was supposedly exiled because someone was tired of hearing how just he was. Democracy, it turns out, has a passive-aggressive streak. What's disturbing is how smoothly the process ran. You could go from celebrated to erased with the scratch of a stylus. And because ostracism came with no confiscation of property or dishonor, it was seen as human even though it uprooted lives and rewrote legacies. It's a system that raises a timeless question. What's more dangerous, the abuse of power, the fear of it? And from the fear of political corruption to the haunting quiet of abandoned stone homes, we turn now to a people who vanished from cliffs and mesas, leaving behind architecture more durable than memory. The disappearance of the Anasazi people. Perched along the cliffs of the American Southwest, carved into sandstone and stacked in mysterious, geometric silence, lie the ruins of the ancestral Puebloans long referred to by the now discarded term Anasazi. Between 100 and 1300 CE, they built elaborate settlements in places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Structures with multiple stories, astronomical alignments, and complex road network cities designed with cosmic intent and communal logic. And then, they left. Around the end of the 13th century, these remarkable stone cities were abandoned, not with fire or battle, but with a quiet, systematic exodus. No mass graves, no clear sign of catastrophe. Just empty dwellings, kivas sealed up, tools left in places if the people intended to return but never did. Theories abound: prolonged droughts, resource depletion, internal conflict, religious upheaval, even social reorganization. Some believe they merged with other Puebloan cultures to the south. Others suggest something more intangible, a societal shift that made the cliffs no longer feel like home. What's left behind is an eerie permanence. Buildings that cling to cliff sides with stubborn grace, petroglyphs that hint at stories we can't fully translate, footpaths still etched in the rock. The ancestral Puebloans didn't disappear. Their descendants live on in Hopi, Zuni, and other native groups, but their great cities fell silent, transformed into monuments of unanswered questions. From silent cliffs to roaring arenas, we now descend into the brutal world of gladiators, where life, death, and spectacle were separated by a thumb's direction. The Roman practice of gladiator games. To the Romans, the arena wasn't a stage for barbarity, it was a theater of order. Gladiators, drawn from slaves, prisoners, and volunteers, fought for survival and spectacle in blood-soaked sand, beneath the eyes of emperors and the roars of crowds. It was public execution disguised as entertainment, and politics dressed in iron. But the games were more than duels. They included wild animal hunts, venationes, mock naval battles, naumachii, and elaborate reenactments of historical or mythical scenes. Sometimes, the arenas were flooded for maritime combat. Sometimes, entire forests were recreated indoors to stage exotic animal slaughters. The death wasn't always guaranteed. Gladiators were investments. They were trained in specialized schools, given diets to maintain muscle, and even had fan followings. A skilled fighter might win his freedom or become a legend. But make no mistake, the crowd's will was law. A downed opponent's fate often rested on a collective thumbs up or down, with the emperor presiding as master of life and death. The disturbing part wasn't just the violence, it was the normalization of it. Children attended, merchants sold souvenirs, poets wrote odes to favorite fighters. The games reflected Rome's core philosophy: domination through discipline, power through performance. And even now, echoes of this remain. In our sports, our media, our obsession with spectacle over substance. But next, we take a gentler detour into a strange medieval tradition that allowed women, on one rare day, to take marriage proposals into their own hands. The medieval leap year baby tradition. Every 4 years, the calendar grants us an anomaly, the 29th of February. To modernize, it's a correction, a temporal tweak to keep seasons and stars in sync. But in medieval Europe, this rare date came with its own cultural loophole. Women could propose marriage to men. Known as the ladies' privilege, this leap year tradition flipped the expected gender norms at least for a day. The origins are foggy. Some link it to St. Bridget and St. Patrick in a likely apocryphal Irish legend. Supposedly, Bridget complained that women had to wait too long for men to propose, so Patrick declared that women could do the asking-once every 4 years. It was a theological compromise dressed up as folklore. In practice, the tradition took hold in pockets across Europe. In Scotland, a 13th century law allegedly formalized it, and in some regions, men who declined a proposal had to pay a forfeit money, silk gloves, or a kiss. A quaint punishment for rejecting a woman brave enough to invert the norms. It wasn't widespread, nor was it universal, but it stuck in cultural memory, resurfacing in literature and romantic comedies, a strange blend of superstition, satire, and proto-feminism. What's unsettling is how rare the opportunity had to be for it to feel permissible. One day, every 4 years. That was the allowance for a woman to express desire publicly. Anything more would disturb the balance. Even progress, it seems, requires a costume. And from proposals to puzzles, let's look at the stone spheres of Costa Rica, perfectly carved orbs from a vanished civilization that still roll through the murky realm between archaeology and mystery. The mystery of the stone spheres of Costa Rica. Scattered across the jungles, riverbeds, and banana plantations of Costa Rica lie hundreds of stone sphericum small enough to hold in your hand. Others weighing over 15 tons and measuring more than 6 feet in diameter, perfectly round, mysteriously placed, and carved by a civilization that left no written records explaining their purpose. Discovered in the 1930s during clearing for a United Fruit Company plantation, the spheres were so precise that workers tried to blast them open, assuming they contained gold. They didn't, just stone. Smooth, unyielding, silent. Created by the Deckees culture flourishing between 700 and 1000, 500 Sethese orbs were shaped using hammerstones and abrasives. That much is clear. But why they were made, and how they were transported over miles of jungle terrain, remains unanswered. Some believe they marked astronomical alignments. Others think they delineated sacred spaces, functioned as status symbols, or played a role in burial rituals. But many of the spheres have been moved, looted, or destroyed, so whatever pattern they once held is likely lost forever. The spheres disturb not because they defy explanation, but because they hint at an understanding we've lost, a form of knowledge that didn't survive colonization, disease, and time. They sit now in museums, parks, and front yard objects stripped of meaning, polished for display. Each one is a question in granite. And now, from stone silence to imperial indulgence, let's feast on the bizarre culinary legacy of a Roman emperor who served up parrot tongues, camel heels, and roasted decadence with side orders of madness. The Roman Emperor Heliogabalus's food practices. Elagabalus, also known as Heliogabalus, didn't just rule Rome. He devoured it. Crowned emperor in 218 AD, at the age of 14, he used the imperial throne like a dining table, where excess was the only menu item. His banquets were legend, theatrical, grotesque, and stunningly wasteful. He served peacock brains, camel heels, flamingo tongues, and the occasional dish made entirely of nightingale hearts. Sometimes, the food was dyed unnatural colors. Other times, guests were showered with flower petals. So many, in fact, that one dinner party reportedly ended with a guest suffocating beneath the fragrant avalanche. Elagabalus didn't just want to impress, wanted to bewilder. He reversed courses during meals, served dessert first, and sometimes had food hidden inside animals that would be theatrically carved open. It was cuisine as chaos. But it wasn't just about food. It was control, disguised as hospitality. He delighted in humiliating guests, seating them on whoopee cushion like bladders, serving wax or stone replicas of dishes, or having servants steal their belongings mid-meal. Beneath the gluttony was a deeper appetite for power, attention, and the obliteration of norms. His feasts were mirrors, showing Rome what it had become: bloated, unstable, teetering on the edge of parody. Eventually, his reign, and dinners, became too much. He was assassinated at 18. His body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. Even Rome has its limits. And from imperial indulgence to divine whispers, we turn now to a sacred mount where a woman breathed fumes and spoke riddle sand entire city-states hung on her every cryptic word. The ancient Greek Delphic oracle. High upon Mount Parnassus, at the temple of Apollo, the ancient world consulted its most enigmatic advisor, the Delphic oracle. She wasn't a priest or philosopher. She was the Pythia woman chosen for her purity, her presence, or perhaps just her willingness to inhale volcanic fumes and let the gods speak through her. Sitting on a tripod above a chasm in the earth, the Pythia would enter a trance-like state, possibly induced by ethylene gases seeping up from beneath the temple. There, she would mutter and moan, speaking in fragmented phrases interpreted by priests. The messages were always cryptic, always malleable truth wrapped in riddles, like fortune cookies laced with consequences. City-states, kings, and generals all made pilgrimages to Delphi. They asked about wars, laws, marriages, colonization. The oracle gave them what they wanted answers with enough ambiguity to serve any outcome. Croesus, king of Lydia, famously asked whether he should go to war with Persia. The oracle told him a great empire would fall. He attacked. His own empire was the one that fell. That was the brilliance and the terror of the oracle. She never lied. She just never clarified. You were responsible for the interpretation, and when things went wrong, you couldn't blame her. You'd already heard the truth. You just didn't understand it. Delphi wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a spiritual courtroom where the line between divine insight and human delusion was paper thin. And now, from prophetic whispers to bureaucratic marvels, let's visit the ruins of an empire's back office etched in clay and sealed in time. The Persepolis Tablets. Buried beneath the splendor of Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Achaemenid Empire, archaeologists uncovered something less glamorous, but far more revealing. Thousands of clay tablets, inscribed in Elamite cuneiform, detailing the day-to-day operations of a vast imperial machine. Known as the Persepolis Tablets, these artifacts are less dramatic than monuments, but infinitely more intimate. Dated around 500 BCE during the reign of Darius the Great, the tablets provide receipts, rations, travel logs, work orders, and administrative records. They reveal a world of scribes and supply chains, of temple workers receiving wine, laborers being paid in grain, and messengers carrying letters across hundreds of miles of empire. What's eerie isn't just their content, it's their survival. They were buried during Alexander the Great's conquest and subsequent torching of the city. The fire baked the clay, accidentally preserving them for over 2 millennia, an act of destruction that became an act of conservation. The tablets show an empire not just of swords and satraps, but of organization. Women appear in the records supervising labor, managing estates, participating in the economic system. It wasn't a utopia, but it wasn't a monolith of male dominance either. Each tablet is a pixel in a long-lost portrait. Together, they depict not just power, but paperwork. The empire was held together not only by armies and palaces, but by math, memory, and ink on wet clay. And speaking of imperial ego projects, let's now turn to one man who ordered the sea to obey him, be building a floating bridge, just so his horse could take a stroll. The Roman Emperor Caligula's bridge to Baiae. Caligula, never one to settle for moderation, didn't just cross the line of absurdity, he paved it with boats. Around 39 AD, the young Roman emperor ordered a temporary bridge built across the Bay of Baiae, stretching over 2 miles from Baiae to Puteoli. The reason? To defy a prophecy. A soothsayer had once told Caligula he had no more chance of becoming emperor than riding a horse across the bay. So, when he became emperor, he built the bridge out of spite using ships lashed together and covered with planks and dirt. Then he rode across it, clad in Alexander the Great's armor, just to make a point. The extravagance was staggering. Dozens of ships were commandeered, thousands of soldiers participated, and all for a single, grandiose performance. According to sources like Suetonius, the emperor even hosted feasts and parties on the bridge, turning a petty rebuttal into a floating festival of ego. What's disturbing isn't just the waste of resources, it's the psychology. Caligula's rule was filled with episodes like this, gestures that blurred the line between symbolic power and theatrical madness. He wasn't governing Rome. He was staging a production, and the empire was his unwilling audience. Whether the bridge collapsed, was dismantled, or sank with time is unclear. What remains is the legend, a monument not to engineering, but to delusion. And from a floating road to the whispers of secret societies, we journey next into the shadows of imperial China where rumor, fear, and legend collided in the name of the Sons of the Dragon. The Sons of the Dragon in China. In the mist-veiled annals of imperial China, where history blends with myth and bureaucracy, hides behind calligraphy, whispers linger of a clandestine brotherhood, the Sons of the Dragon. Not a dynasty, not an official lineage, something darker. A secret society woven into the sinews of the empire, reputedly older than most emperors and feared by all who heard its name. Whether they truly existed or were merely the paranoid invention of nervous courtiers is a question history refuses to answer, but the legend persists. The Sons were said to operate behind the throne, orchestrating the rise and fall of officials, generals, even emperors. They were the unseen architects of political fate, the imperial hand behind the imperial face. Their symbol? A dragon, of course, the ultimate emblem of celestial power. But where the emperor wielded it as a banner, the sun supposedly bore it in silence, etched into rings, carved into seals, or burned into hidden messages. They weren't warriors, they were manipulators, alchemists of consequence. Some stories say they helped oppose tyrants. Others suggest they created them. They were blamed for rebellions that started too perfectly, policies that failed too conveniently, disappearances that were never officially acknowledged. The empire never admitted their existence, but rumors found fertile ground in every unexplained scandal. What makes them haunting is what they represent. The fear that power is never really where it appears to be. That beyond the throne, beyond the law, there is always a deeper layer of control, cold, calculated, and unaccountable. And as we drift from dragons to deities, we step into the world of ancient amulets where protection from the unknown was worn around the neck, sewn into the folds of the dead, and shaped like gods in miniature. The ancient Egyptian practice of amulets. To the ancient Egyptians, the world was not safe. Spirits loomed in every corner, benevolent, malicious, indifferent. The afterlife was treacherous, and even daily life required constant spiritual insurance. Enter the amulet, a small charged object worn for protection, health, fertility, and power. Jewelry with a job, ornament with an agenda. Amulets came in many forms: scarabs for rebirth, eyes of Horus for protection, ankhs for life. The heart scarab, placed over the chest of the dead, was meant to keep one's conscience silent during judgment in the afterlife. Do not stand as a witness against me. The spell on the scarab might read, just in case the heart got chatty in the presence of Osiris. They were made of faience, gold, lapis lazuli, stone, even bone. Some were worn daily. Others were placed with the deceased tucked into linen wrappings, nested beside organs, stitched into funerary masks. They weren't symbols, they were tools. Activated through ritual, incantation, or simply by belief. The production of amulets was industrial. Temples, artisans, and merchants all dealt in this sacred trinketry. Even the poorest had access to them, though quality and material varied by status. But the purpose remained consistent: ward off chaos, invite order. What's disturbing is how functionally transactional it all became. Spirituality turned into object economy. One could be buried with dozens Samdridsoph amulets, each performing a specific duty in the metaphysical bureaucracy of the afterlife. It was divine favor through accessory. And from charms that ward off evil to goddesses of wrath, we now descend into the Roman underworld where the Furies waited, patient and vengeful, for justice that was never served in life. The Furies in Roman mythology. In the grim moral calculus of Roman mythology, there was no forgetting a crime, especially not one unavenged. That was the role of the Furies, also known as the Dire. Not deities in the celebratory sense, but agents of cosmic vengeance. Born from the blood of Uranus, they were older than the gods themselves. And unlike the capricious Olympians, the Furies had a singular focus: punishment. They weren't glamorous. They were terrifying. Often depicted as winged women with serpentine hair and eyes that bled hatred, they hounded murderers, oath-breakers, and those who committed crimes against family, especially matricide and patricide. They didn't just kill, they eroded, they tormented, they turned guilt into sickness, madness, sleeplessness. They were unrelenting. In Aeschylus's Oresteia, Orestes is pursued by the Furies after avenging his father's death by killing his mother. His mind breaks, his body fails. Only a divine trial at Athens can stop their pursuit, symbolizing the transition from blood vengeance to law. But even that civilizing touch doesn't erase their origin. The Furies were still there, watching, ready to return should justice falter. To the Romans, they were a necessary terror-proof that cosmic balance had teeth. Not a deterrent, but a response. Not punishment from above, but from below. They serve as a reminder. In ancient belief, morality was not abstract. It had form, and it followed you. And next, we carve our way into one of the world's most stunning lost cities, built into rose-colored cliffs and swallowed by time. A place where water flowed uphill, and civilization thrived in the shadows of stone. The lost city of Petra. Hidden behind a narrow sandstone gorge known as the Sick, the city of Petra lies cradled in the heart of the Jordanian desert, a place so improbable, so surgically carved into cliff faces. It feels like the product of ancient dream logic. Once the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, Petra was a city built on contradictions, a metropolis in a wasteland, a hub of wealth amidst barren rock, a civilization that thrived by staying invisible. At its peak, Petra was a major trade center. Incense, spices, textiles, and ideas flowed in and out through camel caravans, while its inhabitants carved homes, temples, tombs, and theaters directly into the rose-red stone. But what truly defies comprehension is its water system. Through a labyrinth of aqueducts, cisterns, and hidden channels, Petra maintained a steady water supply in one of the driest regions on Earth, proof that ingenuity can bloom even where nothing should survive. Then it vanished. Not in one cataclysmic collapse, but gradually bypassed by trade routes, rattled by earthquakes, and eventually forgotten by the outside world until its rediscovery in the 19th century by a Swiss explorer posing as a Muslim pilgrim. What haunts us about Petra isn't just its beauty. It's that something so monumental, so intricately engineered, could disappear from collective memory for over 1,000 years. A reminder that nothing, no matter how carved in stone, is safe from oblivion. And now we descend from a silent city to a silent emperor Rome who preferred flies to friends, and spent his final years skewering insects while the empire buzzed with something far worse. The Roman Emperor Domitian's fly-catching habit. Domitian was not the worst Roman emperor, but he might have been the pettiest. The stories that survive most famously told by Suetonius paint a portrait of a man deeply withdrawn, paranoid, and oddly obsessed with exterminating anything that annoyed him. Case in point, his infamous habit of spending hours alone in his private chambers, catching flies and skewering them with a sharp stylus. To his critics, it was the perfect metaphor. Domitian didn't just swat nuisances, impaled them, obsessively, and without end. The empire had real problems, but its emperor was preoccupied with imaginary ones, dispatching bugs while conspiracies fermented in his court. But there's something more disturbing than eccentricity here. Domitian's reign was defined by control. He ruled as a self-proclaimed god, reinstated authoritarian practices, and turned the Senate into a rubber stamp institution. He was methodical, efficient, and deeply feared. The fly story wasn't just gossip, it was allegory. It suggested a man who preferred his enemies defenseless, a predator who sharpened his cruelty on the smallest targets before scaling upward. Eventually, the paranoia that defined his leadership consumed him. He surrounded himself with spies, executed close allies, and became convinced that betrayal was imminent. He was right. In 96 AD, he was assassinated by members of his court, including his own wife's steward. He died alone, much like the flies he had once so gleefully dissected. From solitary emperors to monumental enigmas, our next stop is in southern Africa, where a city of stone once rose without mortar, ruled without writing, and shattered colonial expectations with every excavated wall. The Great Zimbabwe Enigma. Rising from the high veld of southern Africa, the stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe are massive, enigmatic, and maddeningly misunderstood. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries by a powerful and sophisticated Bantu-speaking civilization, this city was the heart of a kingdom that controlled trade routes stretching to the Indian Ocean. Gold, ivory, and other riches flowed through it, but it left behind no written records, just walls, artifacts, and silence. The architecture itself defies colonial narratives. The great enclosure, with walls over 30 feet high and hundreds of feet long, was constructed without mortar. Each granite block was carved and stacked with exacting precision. It was a feat of engineering and aesthetics proof of an indigenous African empire that needed no European blueprint. But when European explorers stumbled upon it in the late 19th century, they couldn't accept the obvious. The very existence of Great Zimbabwe challenged the racist myth that sub-Saharan Africa had produced no advanced civilizations, so they invented alternatives. Theories ranged from Phoenicians to ancient Egyptians, anyone but the locals. Archaeological evidence disproved these claims again and again, but the lie lingered. What remains today is a site of national pride for Zimbabwe. So important, the country took its name from it. Yet the full purpose of the city remains elusive. Was it a royal capital? A religious center? A trading hub? Likely all three. But without a written language, the stones speak only in fragments. Great Zimbabwe is not just a ruin, it's a rebuke to historical denial. And now, we go from forgotten stones to a famously remembered philosopher who was condemned not for his crimes, but for his questions. The ancient Greek trial of Socrates. In 399 BCE, Athens, a city that prided itself on democracy, logic, and civic virtue, put its most irritating thinker on trial. Socrates, philosopher, gadfly, professional question asker, was charged with two things: corrupting the youth and impiety. In other words, he was accused of being annoying and insufficiently patriotic toward the gods. The trial was as much a spectacle as it was a proceeding. Socrates didn't defend himself in any conventional sense. He mocked his accusers, questioned their premises, and suggested that instead of punishment, the city should reward him with free meals for life. This was not, it turned out, the most persuasive defense strategy. The jury found him guilty. His punishment? Death by hemlock, slow, numbing poison. Offered the chance to flee or recant, Socrates declined. He believed in the law of a flawed one and chose to die by it. His final words, after calmly drinking the poison, were directed to a friend. "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. See that it is paid." A cryptic reference perhaps to healing and death being part of the same system. What makes the trial so haunting isn't just the injustice, it's how familiar it feels. A society, rattled by war and insecurity, lashes out at its critics. A public turns against nuance. And the man is killed, not for what he did, but for what he represented: doubt. And now, from courtroom drama to nautical catastrophe, let's shift to a floating disaster that altered the course of empires and sank with it the pride of a Catholic monarch. The disaster of the Armada, 1588. The Spanish Armada was supposed to be invincible. Launched by King Philip II of Spain in 1588, it was a naval colossus, 130 ships strong, tasked with invading Protestant England, overthrowing Queen Elizabeth I, and restoring Catholic supremacy. What followed was not triumph, but humiliation by wind, flame, and hubris. The plan was already shaky. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and launch a full-scale invasion. But English naval commanders especially, the cunning Sir Francis Drake, employed hit-and-run tactics, fire ships, and superior maneuverability. Spanish galleons, built more for bulk than agility, were harassed relentlessly. Then came the real enemy, the weather. After retreating north around Scotland and Ireland, the Armada was decimated by storms. Shipwrecks littered the coastlines. Thousands of Spanish sailors drowned or starved. Of the original fleet, less than half returned. The failure was more than military, it was psychological. Spain's aura of dominance cracked. England, underdog of the seas, emerged emboldened. The balance of European power began to shift. And yet, the defeat wasn't inevitable. It was the result of miscommunication, bad weather, and overconfidence, three variables that have torpedoed countless military endeavors. The Armada's ghost would haunt Spanish ambition for decades. But even as empires fell, underground cults were rising, mysterious, torchlit enclaves where loyalty to Rome bowed before the bull-slaying god of shadows. The Roman Mithraic mysteries. Beneath the bustling streets of Roman cities, hidden in cellars and caves, the followers of Mithras gathered in secret. This wasn't just a religion, it was a ritualistic brotherhood. A mystery cult that spanned the empire, from Britain to Persia, and left behind cryptic clues, but no scripture. Mithras, a god of Persian origin, was adopted and transformed by Roman soldiers into a deity of light, order, and victory. His most iconic image, found in underground temples called Mithridaepics, him slaying a sacred bull, often surrounded by zodiac symbols, torchbearers, and cosmic imagery. The meaning remains opaque, but the imagery is consistent, suggesting a tightly controlled ritual tradition. Initiation was no small feat. 7 levels of rank, tests of endurance, oaths of secrecy, meals shared in symbolic communion. The cult excluded women and was especially popular among the military, those who valued hierarchy, loyalty, and silent strength. What's disturbing is not that so little is known, but that so much was deliberately concealed. The Mithraic cult operated in the shadows of Roman society, parallel to the state's official pantheon. It was tolerated, but never fully embraced by the elite. Eventually, as Christianity rose to dominance, Mithraism faded, its temples buried or destroyed, its secrets swallowed whole. Today, we're left with ruins and symbols. And a mystery. How did a religion so widespread, so organized, leave behind no central text, no doctrine, no definitive voice? From subterranean sanctuaries, we rise now into madness again, this time, led by children, marching toward a holy war that was never theirs to begin with. The Children's Crusade. 1212. In 1212, Europe's holy ambitions took a strange, disturbing turn when thousands of children, inspired by faith or manipulated by myth, set off to reclaim the Holy Land. The Children's Crusade wasn't officially sanctioned, nor was it militarily viable, but it captured the imagination of the medieval public like no other crusade before it. And then it disappeared, swallowed by silence, betrayal, and the Mediterranean Sea. There were reportedly 2 movements, one in France, led by a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes, and one in Germany, led by a boy named Nicholas. Both claimed to have received divine visions. Both preached that only the purity of children not steal or kings could succeed where armies had failed. Thousands followed. Poor, barefoot, barely into adolescence, they marched southward with songs and prayers, believing the sea would part for them. It didn't. Instead, many starved or died along the way. Those who reached Marseille were reportedly tricked by merchants who promised safe passage to the Holy Land only to sell them into slavery. Ships vanished. Records broke off. The surviving accounts are contradictory, riddled with hagiography, anti-Semitic digressions, and implausible embellishments. But the core remains. A generation of children used as tools of spiritual warfare, abandoned to history. What's most unsettling is not just that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen. A mass mobilization of minors, encouraged by clergy and communities too swept up in righteousness to question logistics or morality. From weaponized innocence to ritualized instruction, We now turn to the ultimate guidebook for the afterlife, a sacred scroll used to navigate the land of the dead, spell by spell. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. Death, for the ancient Egyptians, was not an end but a bureaucratic journey full of checkpoints, judges, crocodile demons, and divine paperwork. To navigate this perilous path, they created the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, prayers, and incantations designed to help the deceased reach the afterlife unscathed. It wasn't a single book, but a customizable manual. Scribes would tailor the content to each individual, inscribing it on papyrus scrolls or tomb walls, slipping it between linen wrappings, or placing it near the mummy. Wealthier Egyptians could afford elaborate versions. The poor settled for shorter spells. But the goal was universal: don't die wrong. The text includes some of history's oldest known religious literature, spells to open doors in the underworld, charms to keep one's heart from betraying them in judgment, instructions on how to speak the right names, offer the right phrases, and walk the right paths in the Duat-the Egyptian underworld. One of the most iconic spells is the weighing of the heart scene. The deceased's heart is placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at, truth and justice. If the heart is heavier laden with sin, it is devoured by Amet, a chimera of crocodile, lion, and hippo. No afterlife, just annihilation. What's remarkable is the degree of personalization. These weren't one-size-fits-all religious texts. They were tailored spiritual blueprints, as unique as the person they were made for. It reflects a culture obsessed not just with death, but with doing death correctly. And now, back to the bog. Back to the preserved silence of those who may have been given to the earth not as corpses but as offerings. The bog bodies and human sacrifice. The European peat bogs are cold, acidic, and eerily effective at preservation. For centuries, they've yielded corpses in stunning condition: hair, skin, stomach contents, all intact. But these aren't natural deaths. They're deliberate, ritualistic, and more often than not violent. These are the bog bodies, humans deposited into the wetlands of northern Europe as offerings, punishments, or both. Tolland man, found in Denmark, still wears a noose around his neck. Lindo man, discovered in England, had been bludgeoned, strangled, and had his throat cut. Many bear signs of torture: broken bones, smashed teeth, scalps removed, and yet they weren't buried in cemeteries. They were sunk into the bog, curled or face down, as if pressed into the earth by unseen hands. Most date from the Iron Age, a period of social upheaval and religious intensity. Some theories suggest these individuals were executed as criminals or scapegoats during crisis. Others believe they were volunteers or chosen victims offered to appease gods of fertility, war, or harvest. What's deeply unsettling is the calmness of some of their expressions. Tolland man, for instance, looks almost asleep. Was he drugged? Willing? Was his death a sacrifice, or an execution disguised as one? The ambiguity makes it worse. The bog preserves not just flesh, but context. Pollen in the stomach tells us what they ate before dying. Hairstyles reveal status. Twine, cloth, and tools surround them like footnotes to a forgotten ritual. They are the best preserved corpses of pre-modern European, the least understood. From peat-stained martyrs, we now ascend to the only Roman emperor who walked away from power voluntarily, with cabbages on his mind. The Roman Emperor Diocletian's abdication. In a world where emperors typically died on their throne or on the pointy ends of conspiracies, Diocletian did something unthinkable. He quit, voluntarily. In 305 AD, after 2 decades of ruling a fractious, hemorrhaging Roman Empire, Diocletian stepped down from the most powerful position in the known world, and then he retired to a palace in what is now Croatia, to grow cabbages. This wasn't a hasty decision. Diocletian had spent years restructuring the empire, dividing it into eastern and western halves, creating the tetrarchy, a system of shared rule, reforming the tax system, and purging corruption. He was a bureaucrat emperor, a spreadsheet sovereign, pragmatic, stern, efficient, and tired. When illness struck and the weight of governing grew too heavy, he walked away. When his co-emperor Maximian begged him to return amid fresh chaos, Diocletian reportedly said, "If you could see the cabbages I have grown with my own hands, you wouldn't be asking me to take up the crown again." But Rome was not a system that welcomed retirement. Power had no off switch. The empire soon slid back into civil war, the tetrarchy collapsed, and Diocletian's reforms were dismantled. He lived long enough to see it all unravel, but never returned to the fray. His abdication wasn't just rare, it was singular. No emperor before had done it. Few after would try. His legacy is that of a man who understood the limits of control, and unlike most rulers, knew when to stop. And now, from reluctant rulers to forgotten sagas, we sail with Norse explorers who etched the edges of myth into the coastlines of a new world centuries before Columbus ever set sail. The Vinland Sagas. Long before the Nina, the Pinta, or the Santa Maria ever drifted across the Atlantic, there were Norse ships slicing through icy waters, driven by wind and bloodthirsty curiosity. The Vinland Sagastuo medieval Icelandic texts, known as the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric, the Red Tell of a voyage to a mysterious western land, Vinland. Vinland, with its wild grapes, vast forests, and fertile lands, is widely believed to refer to parts of coastal North America, possibly Newfoundland. According to the sagas, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000 AD and found this strange, bountiful place. Others followed. Temporary settlements sprang up. Skirmishes with indigenous peoples referred to in the sagas as scrallings led to violence, retreat, and eventual abandonment. The Vinland Sagas are not history as we know it. They're a blend of memory, oral tradition, hero worship, and contradiction. Different versions give different roots, different leaders, even different outcomes. But their core claim that the Norse reached the Americas 500 years before Columbus was long dismissed as folklore until archaeological evidence at Lanceau Meadows confirmed it. What makes the sagas eerie isn't just their age, but their tone. They are tales of discovery tinged with fatalism. The Norse find a paradise, but cannot hold it. They arrive first, but are destined to vanish. Even in victory, the edge of the world proves unconquerable. From northern myths to cursed tombs, we now descend into a chamber, sealed for millennia where death doesn't sleep, and those who disturb it may carry the price forever. The ancient Egyptian curse of the pharaohs. In 1922, when Howard Carter cracked open the sealed tomb of Tutankhamun, the modern world got its first true taste of ancient dread packaged as headline material. The tomb, buried for over 3,000 years, had remained largely untouched, a glittering, golden chamber of forgotten royalty. But what followed was not just archaeological triumph, it was whispered retribution. Soon after the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon, financier of the expedition, died suddenly. A mosquito bite became infected. He died in Cairo. At the moment of his death, it said the lights in the city went out. Back home in England, his dog howled and dropped dead. Newspapers ran wild with headlines of "The Mummy's Curse." More deaths followed. People connected to the excavation died under strange or premature circumstances. Accidents, illness, suicides. The pattern was loose, often exaggerated, but the narrative stuck. Ancient Egypt had struck back. The curse of the pharaohs had crossed time. Rationalists scoffed. There were no inscriptions threatening doom in Tutankhamun's tomb. Some suggested mold spores, toxins, or mere coincidence. But curses don't need evidence. They need atmosphere. And the tomb, with its sealed doors, painted walls, and whisper of eternity, had plenty. The real curse, perhaps, was psychological. The price of trespassing on a belief system that never asked to be unraveled. The ancients took great pains to ensure their dead remained undisturbed. Their rituals, their magic, their architecture all pointed toward permanence. And when modernity pierced that bubble, something old stirred not in the tomb, but in us. The lost 10 tribes of Israel. In the 8th century BCE, the ancient kingdom of Israel was shattered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. 10 of its 12 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh were exiled, marched away from their homeland, and swallowed by the machinery of conquest. And then, silence. No chronicles, no monuments, no definitive return. Just a gaping hole in the narrative of a people defined by their memory. These tribes are now known as the lost 10 tribes of Israel, not because they vanished physically, but because they vanished from identity, assimilated, dispersed. Absorbed into the great forgetting of empire, their fate became a theological question, a historical enigma, and a template for messianic speculation. Where did they go? Did they survive? And if so, as who? Over the centuries, countless groups have claimed descent from these tribes ranging from Pashtuns in Afghanistan to Native American tribes to Japanese lineages. Some claims were earnest, others were politically convenient, but all fed into a deeper longing, the hope that what was broken could be made whole again. In Jewish eschatology, the return of the lost tribes is tied to the Messianic age. Until then, their disappearance remains a divine riddle. The very idea that a people could vanish not through death, but through dispersal, through too much forgetting, that is what disturbs. And from tribal oblivion, we move to a more intimate betrayal. Not the fall of nations, but the quiet murder of a brother by another, performed with the decorum of imperial succession and the cold logic of power. The Roman Emperor Caracalla's fratricide. In 211 AD, 2 brothers inherited the Roman Empire. Caracalla and Gedesins of Septimius Severus became co-emperors, tasked with ruling jointly. They hated each other instantly. Caracalla was the elder, ruthless, impatient, and militaristic. Geta was more refined, diplomatic, and popular with the Senate. The empire had seen fratricidal tension before, but never quite so brazen. The palace became a powder keg. Guards loyal to one brother were distrusted by the other. Meetings were held separately. Even their mother, Julia Domna, tried to mediate but failed. Then Caracalla made his move. According to surviving accounts, Caracalla lured Geta into their mother's private chambers under the guise of reconciliation. There, in what should have been a sanctuary, his men stabbed Geta to death. Julia Domna, caught between her sons, was reportedly spattered with her younger son's blood as he died in her arms. Caracalla didn't stop at fratricide. He launched a purge executing Geta's supporters, erasing his name from monuments, banning his image. It was damnatio memoriae in action, the Roman practice of obliterating someone's existence from history. But as with all attempted erasures, the act only immortalized the crime. Caracalla ruled alone after that, his reign marked by paranoia and cruelty. He expanded Roman citizenship, yes, but also expanded fear. His own assassination came 6 years later, on the road to a military campaign, betrayed by a soldier while relieving himself. From bloody siblings to lonely sailors, we now drift from palace intrigue into uncharted waters, guided by an ancient Greek whose voyage would map not just geography, but the edge of ancient imagination. The voyage of Pythias. In a time when the known world ended at the edges of the Mediterranean, Pythias of Massalia, modern-day Marseille, did something unprecedented. He sailed into the unknown. Around 325 BCE, this Greek explorer embarked on a voyage northward that would take him beyond the Pillars of Hercules, around the coasts of Britain, and possibly into the Arctic Circle. What he found was astonishing and disbelieved. He wrote of a land where the sun barely set, where amber washed ashore like pebbles, where the sea turned thick and sluggish with ice. He called one of these distant places Thula, a land so far north it became a metaphor for the unreachable. He described tidal cycles influenced by the moon and a world where the familiar laws of nature seemed to dissolve. His contemporaries scoffed. Many believed he fabricated the journey. Others accused him of mixing myth with observation. The problem wasn't that Pytheas was wrong, it was that he was too early. Later, science confirmed many of his claims: the correlation between tides and lunar phases, the existence of icy seas, the rough geography of northern Europe. But Pytheas wasn't sailing for conquest. He wasn't sent by a king. He was a mathematician, a geographer, a curious mind on a solo mission against the limits of his culture's knowledge. That made him dangerous. He returned with maps, measurements, and theory and was largely ignored. His original writings are lost. We know of his voyage only through second-hand references, pieced together from skeptical sources. The man who glimpsed the Arctic was erased by history's frost. And now, from forgotten explorers to invisible puppet masters, we slip into the shadows of Serbia where a secret society's bullet cracked the world in half. The Black Hand of Serbia. At the start of the 20th century, a secret society of Serbian nationalists known as the Black Hand began quietly orchestrating the end of empires. Officially titled Unification or Death, because subtlety was never part of their branding, the group was formed in 1911 with the aim of liberating South Slavic territories from Austro-Hungarian rule. Its membership consisted of military officers, nationalists, and idealists with a taste for violence. They weren't a government, but they operated like one, funding, training, and arming operatives across the Balkans. Their most infamous act came in 1914, in Sarajevo. Gavrilo Princip, a teenage assassin and Black Hand affiliate, shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. The bullets were real. The implications? World-shattering. Within weeks, Europe's web of alliances snapped into place, and World War I erupted like a long-planted landmine. It's often said that a single gunshot caused a world war, but that's only partly true. It was a gunshot from a group that believed in chaos as a form of progress. What's disturbing isn't just the assassination, it's how close it came to failing. The initial bombing missed. The route was botched. Princip happened to spot the Archduke's stalled car during a chance detour. A revolution, triggered by poor scheduling and dumb luck. After the war began, the Black Hand quickly outlived its usefulness. Its leader, Dragutin Dimitrijević, codename Apis, was arrested and executed by Serbians. The group had become an international embarrassment, a rogue element too wild even for its motherland. The Black Hand's legacy isn't just in bullets, but in the idea that the shadows move faster than governments and often hit harder. From gunmen in the alleys of Sarajevo to knights in the shadows of the Vatican, we now turn to another secretive orderone that was too powerful, too rich, and eventually too damned to survive. The Knights Templar dissolution. They started as warrior monksmen who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then marched off to the Holy Land to protect Christian pilgrims with swords. The Knights Templar were the shock troops of the Crusades, but within 2 centuries, they had become something else entirely: bankers, landowners, diplomats, and kingmakers. The Templars weren't just holy warriors. They were a multinational corporation with divine branding. By the early 14th century, they owned estates across Europe, operated a financial network that rivaled any state treasury, and had the kind of autonomy that made kings nervous. Especially one king in particular, Philip IV of France, deep in debt to the Templars and increasingly suspicious of their influence, he decided to erase the ledger with fire. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. Yes, that Friday, the 13th, Philip ordered the arrest of all Templars in France. The charges? Heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, plus the usual medieval favorites like devil worship and unnatural acts. Under torture, many confessed. Those who didn't were often burned alive anyway. The Pope, pressured and politically cornered, disbanded the order in 1312. The final Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was executed in 1314. Legend says he cursed both the king and the Pope from the flames. Both were dead within a year. What's left today is a smoldering legacy of rumor and myth. The Templars became the go-to name for conspiracy theorists, treasure hunters, and Dan Brown novels. But the real horror lies in their fall. An organization built on faith, shattered by politics, betrayed by the very institutions it served. And now, from sacred betrayal to sacred plumbing, we descend again into ancient sewage, where Roman engineering met religious reverence and dirty water flowed like clockwork. The ancient Roman Cloaca Maxima. Beneath the proud marble and politics of ancient Rome, something older and more essential flowed the Cloaca Maxima, or greatest sewer. Built in the 6th century BCE, it was both practical infrastructure and philosophical statement. Rome's greatness, after all, began with a hole in the ground. Originally an open canal to drain swampland between the hills, the Cloaca Maxima became the backbone of Rome's sanitation system. It funneled waste, stormwater, and runoff from public latrines into the Tiber River. But more than that, it embodied Rome's obsession with order, with mastery over nature, with turning chaos into systems. It also had a goddess. Venus Cloacina, patron of the sewer, was worshipped at a shrine built directly over the system's flow. Imagine offering incense to the divine while the city's refuse gurgled beneath your feet. In Rome, even your toilets had theology. But the real miracle wasn't spiritual, it was structural. The Cloaca Maxima was so well built that parts of it still exist today. Roman engineers achieved something most modern cities still struggle with: efficient, durable waste removal on a massive scale. They were obsessed with hygiene, but only for the upper crust. The poor still lived cheek by jowl in tenements without access to this subterranean privilege. It's not just a sewer, it's a metaphor. Rome saw itself as a civilization that could process filth, civic, moral, literal land, flush it out. They didn't hide the ugliness, they redirected it. And speaking of exile and redirection, we next follow a people uprooted, exiled, and reshaped when the Babylonian captivity scattered the chosen into unfamiliar lands, and identity became survival. The Babylonian captivity, 6th century BCE. It began with a siege, as these stories often do. In 586 BCE, the armies of Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, marched into Jerusalem, breached its walls, and razed its heart, the Temple of Solomon. The center of worship, politics, and divine presence was turned to rubble. The elite were captured and marched east into Babylon, forced to live among their conquerors in an alien empire. This was not just military defeat, it was an existential vacuum. God's chosen people had been displaced, and the God they served seemed silent. This exile now, known as the Babylonian captivity, lasted roughly 70 years, but its impact cannot be measured by time alone. In Babylon, without the temple, Judaism began to transform. Religion detached from geography. Scripture took new form. The exiles began to record, interpret, and consolidate their traditions. Priests became scribes. Oral stories became sacred texts. What had once been a temple-centered religion became portable, text-based, and resilient. It was during this period that prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel emerged, offering visions of restoration and divine justice. But even their fiery rhetoric couldn't fully mask the psychic fracture. The world had changed, and there was no going back to what had been. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great eventually conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return, not everyone did. A diaspora had begun. The Babylonian captivity wasn't merely punishment. It was transformation by fire. And like all transformations, it came with a cost. And now, from spiritual hunger to literal starvation, we moved to a medieval nightmare where rain fell endlessly, crops rotted in the fields, and Europe learned what it meant to starve, not for faith, but for bread. The Great Famine of 1315, 1317. Before the bubonic plague ever swept across Europe, there was another killer's lower, colder and just as relentless. Between 1315 and 1317, unending rain turned fertile soil into sludge. Wheat, oats, and barley failed. Hay for livestock molded in the fields. And as the granaries emptied, so did hope. This wasn't a localized crisis. It was continental. From England to Poland, the Great Famine starved Europe into submission. Famine doesn't come with a bang. It arrives with a whimper, and then lingers. In towns and villages, people first ate their seed grain, then the draft animals, then dogs, then rats, and when the hunger bit deep enough, each other. Chroniclers, normally restrained, spoke of cannibalism, child abandonment, and entire villages left to rot. Crime soared, faith faltered. The church offered prayers and processions, but even that rang hollow. If God controlled the weather, then what did this say about his mood? Governments tried to intervene. Grain was imported, prices were capped, hoarders punished. But logistics buckled under the weight of starvation. Cities were unprepared, villages too remote. It was not just a food crisis, it was a systems failure. When the rains finally stopped and the sun returned, the survivors weren't victorious. They were broken, traumatized, and suspicious of everything, including each other. This was Europe on the brink, hollowed out before the plague had even arrived. And speaking of hollowed out, we now peer into the clay containers that held the viscera of the ancient deadware. Each organ had its own guardian, its own jar, and its own eerie smile. The ancient Egyptian canopic jars. In the afterlife bureaucracy of ancient Egypt, nothing was left to chance, not even your liver. As part of the mummification process, embalmers removed the internal organs too prone to decay and placed them into specially designed vessels known as canopic jars. Each jar was a sacred container, carved from stone or crafted from ceramic, sealed with a lid shaped like the head of a god. There were 4 of them, one for each major organ: stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver. Each jar was assigned a guardiana, son of Horus. Imsidi, human-headed, protected the liver. Hapi, with a baboon's face, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, the jackal-headed, oversaw the stomach. And Kebesenuef, falcon-headed, watched the intestines. They weren't just decorative. These were divine security systems for the afterlife. The heart, interestingly, was usually left in the body, considered the seat of memory and judgment. The brain, removed and discarded. Egyptians didn't believe it had much use. Let that sink in. They preserved the liver but scooped out and tossed the brain like a bad melon. Canopic jars weren't just practical, they were magical. Spells were recited during their sealing, symbols inscribed. These weren't containers, they were guardians, each carrying the responsibility of protecting what remained of the soul's earthly vessel. Finding these jars in tombs today is like uncovering pieces of a lost operating manual and instructions set for immortality, inscribed in stone and silence. And now, from preserved organs to sunken legends, we move toward the Indian Ocean, where beneath the waves lies a city whispered in scripture, debated in science, and drowned in mystery. The lost city of Dwarka. Off the western coast of India, beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea, lies a riddle. It's not just stone ruins or coral-covered wall sits a city, or the ghost of one, Dwarka. Mentioned in Hindu scriptures as the opulent kingdom of Lord Krishna, built of gold, silver, and gemstones, and then swallowed by the sea after his death. Myth? Allegory? Or a memory half drowned? For centuries, Dwarka lived only in the pages of ancient texts like the Mahabharata. Scholars categorized it as mythologia, poetic metaphor for impermanence. That changed in the early 2000s when underwater surveys revealed structures on the seabed, walls, roads, artifacts, geometrically arranged, artificial, too precise to be nature. Suddenly, the myth had architecture. The question wasn't whether people had once lived there. It was when. The carbon dating, the depth, the stratigraphy all became battlegrounds for competing narratives. Some insisted the ruins dated back thousands of years, making them potentially older than the Egyptian pyramids. Others called it wishful nationalism, archaeological pareidolia, city built not by Krishna, but by confirmation bias. What remains is a city submerged, with origins uncertain and implications profound. If ancient Dwarka was real and really that old, then our understanding of early urban development gets wet and complicated. If it wasn't, then it's still a cultural ghost too loud to silence. But perhaps that's the mystery's beauty, its refusal to resolve. Dwarka lies in the tension between legend and limestone, between gods and sonar scans. And now, from underwater cities to overland contagion, we follow the ancient arteries of trade that connected empire sand, also spread death. The Silk Road and the spread of disease. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a web thousands of miles of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. Along these dusty arteries moved silk, spices, jade, and paper. Empires were fed. Cultures exchanged. Religions collided. It was globalism before globalization. But what also traveled, tucked between goods and coins, were pathogens. Plague, measles, smallpox. The Silk Road didn't just carry luxury. It carried latency. The most infamous example? The Black Death. Historians now believe that Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, likely originated in Central Asia. Carried by fleas on rats, it moved with caravans, hiding in furs and fabrics, jumping between travelers and towns. When it finally reached Europe in the mid-14th century, it exploded. But the real horror is how long it traveled unnoticed, how many marketplaces it passed through, how many handoffs and haggling sessions accelerated its journey. The very infrastructure meant to enrich civilizations also made them vulnerable. Contact, connection, collapse. Even before the plague, earlier pandemics had followed similar routes. The Antonine Plague, the plague of Justinian both, likely came via trade. Disease doesn't recognize borders, but it does follow roads. What's eerie is how invisible the threat was. Merchants feared bandits and storms, not microbes. There were no customs inspections for bacteria, no quarantine tents along the caravanserai. Just a sneeze in Samarkand and a funeral in Florence. The Roman Emperor Nero's final days. By 68 AD, the once golden boy of Rome, Emperor Nero, was no longer anyone's favorite artist. The Senate had turned. The Praetorian Guard had defected. The provinces were in open rebellion. Once adored for his theatrical flair, his massive building projects, and his patronage of the arts, Nero had, over time, grown increasingly erratic, paranoid, and dangerously self-indulgent. Rome, it seemed, had grown tired of its self-proclaimed God on stage. The end began not with a dagger, but with abandonment. One by one, his allies disappeared. He was declared an enemy of the state. Even his most loyal servants began slipping away. leaving behind a palace now haunted by silence. Nero fled Rome under cover of night, dressed in disguise, hiding in the villa of a freedman outside the city. There, surrounded by a few remaining companions, Nero realized there was no safe path back. With news that soldiers were approaching to arrest him and that the Senate had ordered a punishment he could not face, he made a decision. With the help of his servant, he took his own life in that quiet villa, far from the marble halls he once ruled. His last reported words, uttered with a mixture of pride and resignation, were, "What an artist dies in me." Rome was stunned. Despite all the drama, his fall had come quickly, and with his passing, so too ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty. What followed was a year of civil war, 4 emperors rising and falling in quick succession. The stage he had once monopolized became a battleground. Nero's legacy is muddied, like many fallen stars. Was he a monster? A misunderstood patron of the arts? A tyrant wrapped in theater curtains? History never quite made up its mind. And now, from the fall of an emperor to the key that unlocked an empire's silence, we turn to a slab of stone that gave language back to the dead. The Rosetta Stone? In 1799, a group of French soldiers digging near the Egyptian town of Rosetta stumbled upon a slab of black basalt. On it were 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Rosetta Stone, roughly 4 feet tall, cracked, weathered, but holding the linguistic DNA of a vanished language system. Before this stone, hieroglyphs were decorative mysteries. Scholars had no idea how to read them. The language of the pharaohs, the builders of pyramids, the authors of spells and curses gone, untranslated, like finding a library but losing the alphabet. But the Rosetta Stone changed that. Because the same text appeared in all 3 languages, it provided a comparative basis for decipherment. Scholars, most notably Jean-François Champollion, worked like cryptographers, matching symbols to phonetics, piecing together the structure of ancient Egyptian. It wasn't quick. It took decades. But eventually, the silence cracked. The dead began to speak. The stone itself wasn't sacred. It was a bureaucratic decree, praising the Ptolemaic king, a tax document essentially. But what mattered was the code. It was the cipher to a buried civilization. And in a beautiful irony, the stone that unlocked the past was found by accident, not in a temple, not in a tomb, but on a construction site, halfway to being rubble. Since then, the Rosetta Stone has lived mostly in the British Museum, a trophy, a tool, and a symbol of knowledge wrestled from stone, a reminder that language is power and understanding is never guaranteed. And speaking of lost giants, our next mystery involves a statue so enormous it rivaled the Sunand and then vanished with the tremor of an angry earth. The Colossus of Rhodes. For a brief moment in ancient history, the sun god Helios stood astride the harbor of Rhodes, taller than memory and forged in bronze. The Colossus of Rhodestone, of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was more than a statue. It was a defiant celebration, a monument to survival after the island repelled a siege from the mighty army of Demetrius I of Macedon in 305 BCE. To commemorate their unlikely victory, the people of Rhodes melted down the enemy's abandoned weapons and cast them into glory. Helios stood about 33 meters tall, roughly the height of the modern Statue of Liberty without her pedestal. He likely didn't straddle the harbor as later romanticized, but even at the side he would have been an awe-inspiring sight. Built by the sculptor Chares of Lindos, the statue took 12 years to complete. For about 54 years, it loomed over the city, catching sunlight on its polished bronze surface and projecting an image of divine guardianship. Then came the earthquake. In 226 BCE, the ground shook, the harbor trembled, and Helios fell. His body crumbled into massive pieces, scattered along the shore. The Rhodians, interpreting the disaster as a sign of divine disapproval, never rebuilt him. The statue lay in ruins for over 800 years, visited and described by travelers, until finally being dismantled and sold for scrap by invading forces. What makes the Colossus so haunting is how little of it remains. No remnants, no replicas, no definitive designs, just footprints in the imagination. A wonder, once towering, now lost not to war or flame, but to the soft violence of tectonic drift. And speaking of cultural erosion, we now look north to the Arctic, where another people vanished not with a bang, but with the quietest kind of erasure. The disappearance of the Dorset people. Long before European ships touched the icy shores of the Arctic, an indigenous people known as the Dorset thrived in a world of snow and silence. From around 500 BCE to 1500 CE, they inhabited the regions we now know as northern Canada and Greenland, leaving behind stone tools, carved masks, and hauntingly sophisticated miniature sculptures. They didn't build cities, they didn't write texts, but they left a distinct cultural footprint across the tundra. Fengone. Around the time the Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, began migrating eastward, the Dorset disappeared. Not abruptly, but subtly. Archaeological traces vanish from the record. Their tools are replaced. Their patterns shift. The Thule, more technologically advanced and better adapted to changing climate conditions, seem to replace them, but the details are murky. What's disturbing is how little we know about the Dorset. They had no boats capable of long-distance travel, no dog sleds. Their lifestyle was uniquely adapted to their environment, settled, ingenious, and deeply rooted. But they left no oral histories that survived, no known descendants. The Inuit later described them in legends as the Tunit, a quiet and shy people with great strength, who fled when confronted. Were they absorbed? Exterminated? Did they simply die out from disease, or fail to adapt to environmental shifts? The truth is buried beneath snow and time. The Dorset remind us that whole civilizations can vanish without headlines, that some cultures leave nothing but artifacts and whispers behind. No wars, no tombs, just the sound of wind where songs used to be. From the Arctic margins, we return to Romedo, a man whose body betrayed him, but whose mind redrew the empire. The Roman Emperor Claudius's limp and stammer. Claudius wasn't supposed to rule. Born into the imperial family in 10 BCE, he was considered too awkward, too slow, too broken to wield power. He limped, he stammered, he drooled. His own family kept him out of public life, assuming him to be little more than a court jester with noble blood. While emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, and their ilk burned bright and fast, Claudius stayed in the shadows reading, writing, waiting. But history has a funny way of rewarding survivors. After Caligula was assassinated by his own guards in 41 AD, Claudius was discovered hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Rather than kill him, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor on the spot. The Senate hesitated, then submitted. The man no one had taken seriously was now the most powerful figure in the known world. And he delivered. Claudius expanded the Roman Empire into Britain, undertook massive public works, and reformed the bureaucracy. He was deeply scholarly, fluent in several languages, and obsessed with administration. His physical impairments had forced him to be a student of people-watching, listening, analyzing. He ruled with a careful hand and a wary eye, often underestimated, but rarely outmaneuvered. His reign wasn't without tragedy. He was manipulated by his wives, especially the infamous Agrippina the Younger, who may have poisoned him to secure the throne for her son Nero. But even in death, Claudius left behind a contradiction. The emperor who was mocked for his disabilities, yet outlasted and outperformed many of his so-called perfect peers. And now, from the underestimated to the underarmed, we drift into Anglo-Saxon England, where military service didn't require a standing army, just a call, a field, and every able-bodied man with a spear. the fyrd system in Anglo-Saxon England. Before standing armies and professional soldiers, there was the fyrd. In Anglo-Saxon England, when a threat emerged, be it Viking raiders, rebellious nobles, or encroaching kingdoms, the response wasn't a polished permanent military. It was a phone call no one could ignore, a collective obligation wrapped in the law of the land. The fyrd was a militia system. All free men, typically between the ages of 16 and 60, were expected to answer the call. No excuses, no exemptions. If you had land, you owed service. Feared men would gather when summoned by the local lord or the king's thangs. They brought their own weapon spears, axes, maybe a sword if they were lucky, and sometimes their own food. Armor was optional. Discipline was uneven. Training, often minimal. But they were loyal, local, and fast to assemble. Think of it as crowdsourced defense before the internet. If the Vikings were landing on the coast, this was the first line of resistance. The law codified these duties. Failure to show up could result in fines, loss of land, or worse. But the system wasn't just about obligation. It was about identity. The fyrd was a civic ritual. Participation reaffirmed your place in the social order. You weren't just a peasant or farmer, you were a defender of the realm. Over time, the system strained under pressure. As threats became more professionalized and complex, the fyrd's limitations became clear. When William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, the English fyrd stood at Hastings brave but outmatched. Their courage was real, their training not enough. And now, from voluntary militias to vanished plays, we move to ancient Greece, where one of the greatest poets wrote a story of grief and rage, and then time swallowed the script. The lost play of Aeschylus' Myrmidons. Aeschylus, the father of Greek tragedy, wrote over 70 plays. Only 7 have survived intact. The rest, including the emotionally loaded Myrmidon sexist in fragments, lines quoted by later authors, scattered like broken amphorae across the literary landscape. Myrmidons told part of the story of Achilles, the legendary warrior of the Trojan War, focusing on his mourning for Patroclus, a loss so profound it ignited an unrelenting fury. This was not the Achilles of Homer's Iliad alone. This was a deeper, more introspective portrayal. In Myrmidons, Achilles wasn't just the rage-filled killer, he was a man grieving, possibly even undone by love. The surviving lines hint at intimacy, tenderness, and emotional nakedness rarely seen in ancient depictions of warriors. But we'll never know the full arc. We don't have the second or third plays in the trilogy. We don't know how Aeschylus envisioned the reconciliation between divine wrath and human sorrow. What we have are glimpses: Achilles refusing food, lamenting the touch of Patroclus, vowing revenge on Hector. It's like hearing a symphony through a crack in the wall. Why does this matter? Because lost art shapes our understanding as much as preserved art. Because history isn't just what survives, it's what we no longer have the tools to imagine. The loss of Myrmidons is the loss of a fuller Achilles, one less encased in armor and more vulnerable in grief. From one flood of emotion to another, only this time, quite literal, we now turn to ancient China, where a deluge of mythic proportions birthed a dynasty and redefined civilization itself. The Great Flood of China, c. 2000 BCE. Long before imperial decrees and Confucian philosophy, there was water, too much of it. The Great Flood of Chinese legend is said to have lasted for generations, submerging vast tracts of land, displacing communities, and threatening the very fabric of early civilization. Mountains were inundated. Fields became lakes. It was not just a flood, it was a reckoning. Enter Yu the Great. According to ancient texts, Yu emerged not as a conqueror, but as a problem solver. He didn't try to block the waters, like his predecessors had failed to do. He redirected them. For years, some say 13, he surveyed the land, dug canals, carved channels, and created a system of flood management so effective that it not only saved his people but earned him the mandate of heaven. Yu became the founder of the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in traditional Chinese historiography. Whether or not the Xia existed as described is debated, but the flood and Yu's legacy run deep in the cultural psyche. He wasn't just a hero, he was a hydrologist, an engineer, and a model of selfless leadership. There are those who believe the flood was a metaphor for social upheaval. Others point to geological evidence of massive flooding near the Yellow River around that era. Either way, the tale persists not because it's comfortable, but because it explains the inexplicable, that nature can both destroy and define us. From land swallowed by water, we now return to a man consumed by appetite where gluttony became ritual, and meals were measured not in courses, but in casualties of taste. The Roman Emperor Vitellius's excesses. If gluttony ever wore a crown, it did so during the brief and bloated reign of Emperor Vitellius. Ascending the Roman throne in 69 AD, also known as the Year of the Four Emperors, Vitellius was the third emperor in a violent game of imperial musical chairs. His rule was short-lived, his policies vague, and his legacy, well, mostly digestive. Vitellius didn't just enjoy food, he devoured it as performance art. Ancient sources claim he hosted 4 meals a day, each more decadent than the last, and filled his banquets with dishes designed not for nutrition, but notoriety. Dishes like flamingo tongues, pike livers, and other luxuries harvested from the farthest reaches of the empire. If it swam, flew, or had a price tag higher than a soldier's annual pay, it was probably on the menu. He allegedly employed a special tasting kitchen to experiment with combinations of rare ingredients. Whole fortunes were swallowed in an afternoon. Yet this wasn't just about indulgence, it was about dominance. The Roman table was a throne of its own, and Vitellius used it to display excess as power, appetite as entitlement. The emperor was also said to force himself to purge between meals, clearing room not out of necessity, but out of ambition. And while these accounts may be tinged with the venom of political rivals, the image stuck. A ruler more obsessed with his gut than his government. He died as violently as he lived, dragged through the streets of Rome by his enemies, pleading for mercy, reportedly clutching his beloved cookbooks. Whether true or embellished, Vitellius serves as one of Rome's cautionary tales that the empire could collapse not just from barbarians at the gates, but from emperors at the buffet. And finally, we dance back to where it all began, it with a single woman in Strasbourg, but with a pattern of inexplicable, rhythmic abandon echoing across Europe. A final twirl in the macabre ballet of unexplained history. The Dancing Plagues, beyond 1518. The Strasbourg incident of 1518 was not an isolated footnote. It was part of a wider, stranger choreographia, recurring phenomenon that historians now call dancing mania. Across medieval Europe, from the 7th century through the 17th, outbreaks of involuntary, contagious dancing erupted in towns and villages. Groups of people, dozens, sometimes hundreds, would begin dancing uncontrollably in public spaces. Days would pass, feet bled, bodies collapsed. Deaths occurred from exhaustion, heart failure, or stroke. These weren't festivals, they were breakdowns. The afflicted often claimed they couldn't stop, even as their limbs failed them, some hallucinated visions of saints or demons. Others reportedly screamed for help mid-gyration, as though trapped inside their own bodies. Theories range from mass psychogenic illness, the modern term for hysteria, to ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold found in rye, to religious fervor sparked by extreme social stress. But no theory accounts for all the patterns or the persistence of the phenomenon over centuries. Why dance? Why not scream, or sleepwalk, or vanish into the woods? Why in groups? Why then and not now? It may be that dancing mania, was the pressure valve for a society stretched too thin, a time when plague, famine, war, and religious dread fused into one long nightmare. Bodies couldn't rebel, so they revolted, publicly, rhythmically, desperately. And just like that, the dancing stopped. The last known cases dwindled by the 17th century. No resolution, no cure, just the echo of feet on cobblestones and the stunned silence that followed. So here we are, not with answers, but with movement. With a final pirouette through the uncanny corridors of history. These were not simply facts, they were fractures. Glimpses into what happens when the world tilts just slightly off its axis and everyone, for a moment, forgets the steps.